All right, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians podcast with Alex Grant and Jim Thompson. Today we have very special guest, Mr. Ron Frenz, who's been a comic artist since the early 1980s, working with Marvel Comics, DC Comics, as well as various independent comics. Ron, thank you so much for joining us today.
It is my pleasure to be here with both of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Ron, we're going to kind of jump back and forth. Jim's going to start on your early years, so take it away, Jim.
Okay, so Ron, you were born in February 1960, is that right?
Boy, when you said early years, you're not kidding, are you? Yes, I was born in a small 800-watt radio station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. No, it was, yes, February 1st, 1960. That's when it all started, yes.
So you and I were born within 2 months of each other, so I'm going to be curious about what you were reading when I was reading and things like that. Now,
okay.
You live in Bellevue?
Yeah, I actually live a hop, skip, and a jump from the hospital I was born in. I grew up in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. 30-some years ago, moved to a borough called Bellevue, which is hilarious when you work for people from New York. Since Bellevue is a psychiatric hospital in New York. So if you ever watched Barney Miller, they always talked about taking all the nutcases to Bellevue. So if you're working for people in an office in New York City and you say you live in Bellevue, they love it. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, I've been living here my entire life, and I love it around here. I've thought about moving more than once, but pretty much always came back around to home is home, you know.
And your father was a paper salesman?
Yes, he was a salesman. He worked in paper products for decades. Actually, before he retired, he took a job with my brother's home heating, fuel, and oil company and was selling home heating product and lubricants. But it was all selling, you know. Yeah, he was a traveling salesman, basically. He had a fairly large area in West Virginia and Ohio and Pittsburgh, and but we always had, you know, reams of paper around the house to draw on, and I think that certainly helped. I never had to draw on the walls, you know, that kind of thing. So yes. And my mom was.
Did you ever go out on the road with him?
No, I went to the office with him a few times, and you know, made some runs with him and stuff. When I was a real young kid, he would do that occasionally when we had a day off of school or something. He was an incredibly personable guy, and when I was growing up, he would always. He had a knack for calling people by nicknames, and he would call people Skip or Pete. And when I was a young kid, I thought my dad knew everybody until I started to realize, wait a minute, everybody's name is Skip or Pete, you know, that kind of thing. But no, my dad was, you know, everybody thinks this about their dad, but he was one of a kind. He was a very personable guy and very successful as a salesman. So, yeah.
You mentioned your brother. Now, you had a brother that was 3 years older than you. Was he kind of a launching pad for you to get interested in comics early?
I would say that was probably the case. I actually have two older brothers and a younger sister. The oldest brother is 13 years older than I am. So he's virtually in a different generation. But yes, the brother, Randall, who's 3 years older, that first comic book that I remember having around the house, that World's Finest that I've talked about on my Facebook page, was a 1964 comic, and I would have only been 4 years old. He would have been 7. So I'm thinking he was responsible for bringing it into the house more than I. So yes, I think we shared a passion for comics, but I would have to give him the nod on that. I would think my first exposure to comics were because of books that he was asking for and not myself. Yeah.
Was there a point where he stopped reading comics and you kept reading them?
I don't think so. He went off to college. When he went off to college, I remember he took most of our DCs and I kept the Marvels. Because we like a lot of kids, we started out on DCs and discovered Marvel in the late 60s, late 60s, because I think my first exposure was probably the Spider-Man cartoon. It was in syndication in the mornings, and I fell in love with Spider-Man and wanted to track down the comics and the old Marvel superhero cartoons and things like that. There was a kid in our neighborhood that we would trade comics with, and he was already into Marvels, so I would get some Ditko reprints and everything through that association.
Have you gone back and looked at those Spider-Man cartoons? Because once they bring in Ralph Bakshi, they get pretty crazy.
They got really crazy. And I even knew that when they went into syndication in the afternoons, when I was in, I would probably have been about 14, 15. They were back in syndication in the afternoons. And that was when I realized that there was that whole season that was more adapted from the comic books and everything, the Grain Trey Lawrence episodes before they handed it over to Bakshi. I'll be honest, my biggest memory I had from seeing them in the mornings in syndication was the Bakshi stuff, was like the Origin cartoon and some of those early ones with the Kingpin and stuff. That's kind of what my memory was. So it was really fun rediscovering those that first season of episodes. And the nostalgia overwhelms me anytime I watch them. So they're wonderful. They're weird, but wonderful. So.
Yep, absolutely. Now, how old were you when you started to notice with the comics where you were paying attention to the artist or the artwork and noticing the differences between different people?
Almost immediately, I think. We were always disappointed. And, of course, my tastes have broadened since. But I remember even as a kid, we were always disappointed when a Superman or an action comic had a Kurt Swan cover but Wayne Boring inside art. So we were recognizing the differences very early on. Of course, DC didn't put credits. I fell in love with the Aquaman cartoon in 1967 or 8, and so I was seeking out Aquaman comic books, and Nick Cardy was doing them at the time. I fell in love with Nick Cardy almost immediately.
Oh, those covers during that period are just incredible.
Yeah, and so I was like nuts about Cardy. So I mean, yeah, I was, and once we discovered Marvel and credits and all of that, I had my favorites and would seek books out based on who was working on them and things. Yeah, I mean, early on, we started when comics were 12 cents. From 12 cents to 15 cents to 25 to 20, back up to 25. During that period of time, my brother and I, we were going to like 3 different places and spinning the spinner rack and buying pretty much every Marvel and DC comic because we could afford to do that. I mean, our dad was willing to. Our allowance was basically that he would buy our comics every week. So that worked out great. I mean, we never had to. I mean, once they started to go up in price, and once I was working in the industry and was getting back in the day, they used to send comps and everything, But yeah, we were pretty abreast of everything. We didn't really read war comics or westerns as much. At one point, I remember being of an age where I was embarrassed to buy romance comics because Marvel was reprinting this stuff, and it was John Buscema inked by John Romita and Gene Colan inked by Sal Buscema, and it was all these wonderful art teams that you didn't see on the superheroes were doing these romance comics, and yet I was, completely mortified to be buying a romance comic like anybody cared, that kind of thing.
Oh, I was buying Millie the Model. I was buying everything Marvel produced, the westerns, all of it.
I can't cop to that. I did become an Archie fan, and I'll tell you one of the things that prompted that was when I was a kid and I was drawing superheroes, I came to realize that if I really wanted to do this for a living, I had to get better at backgrounds, I had to get better at cars and horses, and I had to get better at drawing women. So I was looking at a lot of Don Heck, and then I discovered the Archie comics and Dan DeCarlo and Harry Lucy and guys like that who were fantastic at drawing women and keeping it simple. So I started to pursue a bunch of back issue Archies just to learn how to draw girls. Yeah.
I got hooked on Little Archie and recognized how fun that was. And then I just bought everything Archie had too.
Well, I was never into Little Archie. I have, even with the Archie stuff, I kind of have to cop to the cartoon helping to sell that too, because in the late 60s, there was an Archie cartoon that kind of captured the feel of the Archie books at the time,
Sugar.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was working on the Archie stuff within the last few years, it was always an interesting moment for me because I always kind of considered Archie part of the big three. And when I was working on those couple of Archie stories with Tom DeFalco, and I'd be sitting listening to classic radio, and Sugar Sugar would come on, and it was one of those little moments that, it's like, this is cool. I'm working on an Archie thing and the stuff and the guys. It was neat. It was neat.
So how old were you when you decided you wanted to work for Marvel and when you grew up and draw Spider-Man?
Pretty much I drew constantly. So it was no surprise to anybody. By the time I was 6 or 7, by the time I had discovered Spider-Man, I would tell people that that's what I wanted to do when I grow up. I wanted to grow up, work for Marvel Comics, and draw Spider-Man.
And what did your brother and your father say? Did they laugh, or were they like, yeah, he's good enough, maybe he will?
My brother was always incredibly supportive, even when I didn't really deserve it. He would sit and blow sunshine up my behind that even at the time I remember going, oh, he's being very kind. I was always I had an innate ability, I guess, to be pretty objective about my stuff. So when I would try to copy something, or when I would try to emulate somebody's style, my brother would be going, well, if that artist walked in here right now, he'd wonder, when did I draw that? And I knew he was being too kind. I knew he was just being very supportive. My dad, I don't know what he thought about it. My mom was always incredibly supportive. My mom, on some level, understood from very, very early on that somebody was getting paid to draw these things. They weren't being produced for free, so she never, I never really had to suffer through criticism or doubt or things like a lot of other illustrators have. I've heard the stories, and I was very fortunate. I never really had to live with people telling me it was a pipe dream or anything like that.
So when Spider-Man became your favorite character, who was drawing him at the time? Romita?
Yeah, by the time I was buying new issues off the rack, it was Romita. I discovered Ditko in some of the reprints that I traded for with our neighbor and stuff, and recognized immediately that a lot of the stuff from the old 67 cartoon was taken off of Romita. A lot of the headshots and everything Ditko were taken off of Ditko, and went, that's
sure.
where they got that stuff. But Romita was my first regular monthly exposure to Spider-Man. Yeah, and it was in the 60s, the numbering of the books, it was like the late 60s. I remember the first one, I think the first Spider-Man I bought off the rack new was Bitter Victory, where Kingpin is swinging Spider-Man around by his ankles on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
I think that was my first off the rack, brand new Spider-Man book, and just never looked back. Just loved every minute.
Those Romita covers during his actual run are really, really strong. I love some of those.
They went in your eyes and blew out the back of your head. That's all there was to it. I was just completely obsessed. By seeing Romita and Kirby and Buscema, both Buscemas, I became a probably as close to a Marvel zombie as you could find at the time. I was still enjoying DC stuff, especially Nick Cardy stuff, but yeah, I became a real Marvel devotee. Yeah.
Now, when Ditko went over to, because I wasn't aware of Ditko while he was at Marvel so much until I was later exposed to Doctor Strange and stuff, but I was reading Creeper and Hawk and Dove in real time when they went over. Were you following that stuff?
No, unfortunately, I wasn't at the time. I would see the ads for Creeper and Hawk and Dove in some of the more mainstream DC stuff I was reading, and I was aware of. We were already aware of Ditko on Doctor Strange because we got a whole bunch of the Marvel Tales giants, 25-cent Marvel Tales giants that ran Doctor Strange stuff. My brother, especially, Rand, was deeply into Doctor Strange, and still to this day is. That's still one of his favorite characters. So we were aware of the Ditko stuff there through the reprints. And when he went over to DC, we missed Creeper almost completely. Hawk and the Dove, I was aware of through Teen Titans. I was always following Teen Titans again because of Cardy. But I was aware when Ditko was doing like Stalker and some of that other stuff. There was a DC first issue special where they tried to revive the Creeper, where he fought some lame villain called Firebug or Firefly or something like that. It was
and it just wasn't the same.
No, they couldn't capture the same magic. I've since read the original Creeper run, and it's just ridiculously cool and weird and wonderful. I love the character.
Yeah, that first issue is just that showcase issue is just amazing. The origin story.
Well, DeFalco and I were actually DeFalco and I were discussing doing a Creeper reboot with a DC editor, but it was at a time when DC editorial was not interested in doing anything with the Creeper. It was right before they did that bizarre thing where he was like a Japanese or a Chinese alcohol spirit or some stupid thing.
Yeah, it was awful.
It was right before they did that in Katana that we were told there was absolutely positively no interest in doing anything with the Creeper. And then like a month later, this Creeper shows up in Katana, and it's like, what are you people doing? We had some ideas that they would have deviated from the original Ditko, but I was very interested in keeping as much of the Ditko aesthetic as possible, you know.
Mm-hmm. So did you like the Ditko as much as the Romita?
Yeah. I never pitted the two against each other, to tell you the truth. If you would have put a gun to my head on which books I could keep, I probably would have gone with Romita. Because I maintain that as fantastic and quirky and wonderful as Ditko was, I think when Romita took over the book, it broadened its appeal because Romita's characters were more glamorous and more recognizable and heroic, and it's possible, I don't know this for a fact in any way, shape, or form, but it's possible that the quirkiness of Ditko could conceivably have held Spider-Man back slightly. And when Romita came on and kind of opened it up and brightened it up and made it look a little more, I don't know, I'm really struggling with what words to use here without being insulting to either Romita or Ditko. But he made it look more like a comic, like people were used to seeing in a comic book.
Right. A little more mainstream.
And that it might have opened up his popularity even more, you know. But I don't know.
So let me ask you about some of the other Marvel artists of that time, your impressions when you were a kid, when you were reading it during this age. You were aware of Kirby. What did you think of him, and did you follow him when he went to DC?
We followed him when he went to DC because we were, again, still pretty much reading everything. And I loved his initial blast of books. I loved Jimmy Olsen under Kirby. I loved the first Mr. Miracle. To this day, that first issue of Mr. Miracle is like burned on my brain.
Oh, wow.
We had a little bit of trouble getting all of the New Gods. We never got the first issue. We got like the second issue, and then we missed. You know, so distribution wasn't great. So we had some holes in our New Gods run. But we got all the Mr. Miracles, and I loved them. You know, and Kirby is, you know, I will cop to Kirby being an acquired taste. When I was a kid, I liked Kirby, and the energy of it was there and all this kind of stuff. But anytime, like, Buscema would do a flashback to a Kirby scene, you know, I always preferred the Buscema, you know, that kind of thing. And it wasn't, you know, I think Kirby is somebody that you appreciate more as you become more educated on what he actually was doing. You know, otherwise you become caught up in how he draws fingers and how he draws knees and things like that. And you're not really, you're absorbing the impact of the work, but you're not really absorbing why. And you're more likely to look at the nuts and bolts to try to explain the whole. And that's not how Kirby works. Kirby is impressionistic.
Were you paying attention to the inkers at this point? Because I think that's when I noticed, what that doesn't look like, that's Vince Colletta. That makes it different from what I was reading with Fantastic
Four.
Much
so. Very much so, yeah. I became pretty aware very early on of different artistic styles and what inkers brought to the table, and you know, was very fascinated anytime I could find a fan magazine that would show pencil samples and things. You know, I was very into that stuff and had favorite inkers as well as favorite pencilers and stuff. Yeah.
And who did you like inking on Kirby?
Well, I was a big Sinnott fan. I was, when I was reading the regular stuff in Marvel's Greatest Comics, the initial run inked by Sinnott. I loved Sinnott. I was never a Colletta hater. I liked what Vince would do with a lot of the stuff. I mean, that first issue of Mr. Miracle, like I said, that was Colletta. You know, those early Mr. Miracles have a real feel to them that, as much as I mean, when Mike Royer came along, I was hooked. I loved the way he lettered. I loved the way he inked Kirby. I loved everything about the look of the finished book. I became obsessed with his display lettering. I just loved everything about Mike Royer. But I was never was a hater on inkers. I would notice differences, and I would notice if somebody didn't really quite keep a Buscema face or something like that. But I was never really I always recognized that comics was an incredibly collaborative medium. I never trained myself with the inking tools, so I became, almost to the detriment of my development, I became aware that comics was very collaborative, and I wanted to pencil. I knew I wanted to be a part of the visual storytelling, and so I knew I wanted to be a penciler. So I never really trained myself with the inking tools. Even now, I'm only now getting confident in my inking ability as far as it being a separate discipline from penciling, that kind of thing. So, and I just turned 60, so I'm way behind the curve on that kind of thing.
Let me ask you real quickly about a couple others, and then we'll get to your next step. So, what about Don Heck?
I love Don Heck. My first exposure to Don Heck were the Tales of Suspense Iron Man stories from the old Iron Man cartoon. And I found those stories, like that first battle with Titanium Man, which was inked, I think a couple of chapters were inked by Wally Wood, but I think mostly it was like Esposito, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And I loved Don Heck. So I never, he was never anybody that, I didn't look at Don Heck and go, he's not as good. I love the energy that he had in there. As I've read about how things evolved at Marvel, I liked Don Heck being Don Heck. When he tried, like when they gave him the Avengers and he was trying a little too hard to be Jack Kirby, I don't think it helped him as much as it might have helped him get work, but I don't think it helped his work overall to try to be something he wasn't, to try to keep Stan happy with the Kirby over the top action. I don't think it served Don incredibly well. But those early Iron Man stories that he did, that I was first exposed to on the cartoon, are just incredible to this day. Just amazing stuff. And he was right there on my list of guys that I wanted to grow up and be someday. Absolutely.
Oh, that's great. And then last one, Gene Colan.
The early Daredevil stuff he did with Stan just made me laugh and entertained the hell out of me. Some of it I was seeing in reprint. There was Marvel Triple Action or something for a while that they were reprinting the Daredevils. And the stuff was incredible. I had some early Daredevils off the racks. They might have been given to me by my oldest brother. I'm not sure. But it was beyond my ken as far as some of the photorealism that he would get in there and everything.
And you were still reading in the early 70s when he was doing Tomb of Dracula with Tom Palmer too, right?
I was reading all of that too. Yeah. That first issue by Vinnie Coletta actually inked the first issue of Tomb of Dracula, and I was hooked. In the first issue, I kind of fell away from it later in the run, to my undying shame. But I was reading it from the beginning. That and Mike Plug on Werewolf by Night, and I was sampling
and
all
Man
that
Thing.
Stuff.
Yeah, that was great stuff. All right, so you got a partial scholarship to go to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. Was that straight out of high school?
Yes. Yeah, the last 2 years of high school, I went to a Votech for half a day every day and joined an outfit called VICA, which is Vocational Industrial Clubs of America. And through joining VICA, they have regional and state competitions. And coming in, did I come in second or third? I think I came in third in the state and won a half scholarship to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. So I was able to complete the second year through grants and loans and stuff. But I did the 2-year course at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, which just recently closed down after changing owners how many times. It did me a lot of good. During the 2 years at Votech, I had a really good instructor, a gentleman named Tony Crum, who made me realize that, it's wonderful to have these dreams, but if you don't get into comics, you also don't want to limit yourself. You don't want to just be able to do comics. And he kind of opened my eyes. So the 2 years I spent at the Art Institute, I spent trying to make sure that my stuff didn't look like I was just comics taught. And I started to pay attention to other techniques and other ways of doing things on the chance that my dream would be foiled or delayed and I would have to get a job doing something besides comics for a while. I tried to pay attention to everything else. And of course, that was all pre-computers, and I'm incredibly old. And that was all pre-computers, and we were still using amberlith and rubylith and cutting film for overlays of the different color separations and all kinds of hands-on stuff that nobody in the industry does anymore.
You met Marie Severin before you met Jim Shooter when you showed him the Xeroxes, right?
You guys certainly did your research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a local comic convention, and she was one of the guests, and I took a stack of stuff. Again, they weren't page samples. They were just loose drawings of, dynamic figure work and characters that I had created and things like that. And she was incredibly wonderful and took a lot of time. And she was with everybody, looking through the stuff and giving opinions. And she liked my stuff enough that she wanted me to take it to Jim Shooter and get a sample plot to really start working on storytelling and everything. She had irrational confidence in my ability to do it based on what she had seen in the drawings, but I chickened out that year. It wasn't until I was in the Art Institute that was in downtown Pittsburgh, and Jim Shooter was appearing at a shop within walking distance of downtown Pittsburgh doing autograph signings and stuff, because that's his home turf as well. A couple of buddies of mine and I put together some samples, and I came very close to chickening out there too, but my friends were very supportive and said, if you don't show them your samples, we're going to kill you. So I showed them samples, and by that time I had done some storytelling. I had taken some stories from a friend at the Art Institute. He had his own character, the Pariah, that involved mercenaries in South American jungles and things like that. So we did an origin story for him. Those were the pages that I showed to Jim Shooter, along with a 3-page Spider-Man sequence from Foom magazine.
I was curious about that.
He was amazing. What? The Spider-Man?
The Foom, was that something you copied? That was something you drew for Foom?
It was, Foom was their fan club for a while. Friends of Old Marvel, FOOM. Yeah. And they, at one point in one of their magazines, printed a 3-page sequence. It was for some kind of a contest, I think. They printed 3 pages of plot of Dr. Octopus has Ned Leeds and Betty Brant hostage, and Spider-Man is fighting the Rhino and the Green Goblin, I think, or something. So I just took that from the magazine, not to do the contest, but just to do the pages, working off of somebody else's plot. And, I look back on this stuff now, and obviously Jim Shooter saw something in it he thought he could work with, and said that he would, give my name to editors and that I'd be hearing from them. And I walked out of there thinking, holy crap, that's amazing. And it was a year before I heard anything, but I did end up hearing from them. I had already taken a job at Anavision, an animation house in Pittsburgh that worked on local and regional TV commercials. And we also worked on the 2 Creepshow movies. I've
got questions about that, just a few. Yeah, but I wanted to nail down the timeline. When you met with Marie Severin, were you already out of the Art Institute, or were you?
No, I was still in high school when I met with Marie.
Oh, okay.
Oh, what year would you say that was that you met her?
Well, I graduated high school in 78, so I would say that was probably 77, 78, something like that.
Oh, okay.
And so meeting with Shooter wasn't until towards the end of art school. So the art school, I guess, would have been 79, 80 or 79 to 81 or something like that. And by 83, I think my first published work, the first Ka-Zar stuff, I think was end of 82, 83, something like that.
So was the book, the John Buscema, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, did you read that before you were submitting your stuff?
Yeah, that was one of my Christmas gifts one year. And I went through that until pages were falling out of it and stuff. I did 2 stories for a magazine that was published here out of Pittsburgh called Questar Magazine. They did this would have been when I was working at the animation studio, They were on the floor below us, their offices, and I had shown them some samples. They were aware of my work up in the animation studio, and they had a strip in their magazine called Just Imagine Genie that was originally created by Forrest J. Ackerman.
Yeah.
And was originally drawn by, man, this is embarrassing. What's the guy's name that did the soup cans and everything?
Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol. His brother, James Warhola, did the art on the first Just Imagine Genie strips. Okay.
Wow.
Now they lost Warhola early on. They lost Forrest J. Ackerman early on as far as contributing to the strip. But at one point they had a local writer doing the scripts, and Mike Grell did a couple of installments for them. And then they had just recently lost Mike Grell to other work and everything. And they asked me if I was interested in taking it over. Now, the first published work I did, comics work I did, was for this Questar magazine, this Just Imagine Genie episode that I penciled, inked, and lettered myself. It looks like it. The reason I bring it up is because there are panels in there that are lifted directly out of How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. So that was my Bible, as I was, and my crutch as I was first getting into doing published work. And then the second installment I did of Just Imagine Genie was in full color, and I lettered it and colored it myself with markers and stuff for full color publishing. That was very bizarre too, because the guy I worked with at the animation studio, my boss there, Rick Catazone, introduced me to different illustrators and stuff, and I'm trying to remember the one gentleman's name, and I'm not coming up with it. But there was that, and I was going through, in art school, I went through a big Gene Colan phase where I was trying to recreate some of the dynamics of Gene Colan's work. So there was a weird mix of stuff going on in my brain at the time. But those would have been my first two published pieces. And what can I tell you?
Let me ask you a little bit about Anavision.
Okay.
You mentioned Creepshow. What
Right.
were you doing on the first one, the 1982 one? What were you doing? Were you doing storyboards?
Well,
or were you
I was
working on
hired.
the animation?
I was hired in general based on my portfolio that I could draw from memory, and that I had a solid grasp on anatomy and things like that without having to use much in the way of reference. So he used me initially for some storyboarding. He used me for in-betweening, which is exactly what it sounds like. He does the key drawings, and I do all the drawings in between. So that's kind of what I did on Creepshow. The original Creepshow, we did some stuff on colored paper. The scene where they pull the camera back and the creep flies back and points down at the garbage can, and we come in on the comic book and everything. That was all done on colored paper with colored pencil. The backgrounds were, and so there was all kinds of different media being used in that. But the only artwork of mine that you see in the first Creepshow directly are the opening credits, and the creeps had to be inserted into some of the splash pages. One of the original EC guys did the pages, the transition pages for the first movie. But when they decided to use the creep as a host, we had to rejigger some of the splash pages and kind of stick the creep in there as the host. And I did some of that artwork.
Nice.
But,
so when you say original EC guys, you mean Jack Kamen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they brought him out of retirement to do the original transition pages and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So there's some stuff online that's described as tryout things for you from that. Do you know what that was?
Yeah, those were marker renderings that I did early on when we were just seeing the beginnings of the script. My boss wanted me to do basically audition to do the transition pages and stuff, which didn't happen because they were able to get a hold of Jack Kamen. So yeah, that's what that was. It was like the splash page for The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, and I think I did one for the end of Father's Day or
the
something.
Birthday
like that.
one.
Yeah,
it was the birthday one.
Those were heavily influenced by my boss was pointing me towards like Bernie Wrightson and all this kind of stuff, and he said, we were trying to basically do as much of it in-house as we possibly could. And actually, for the second one, we ended up doing that. I did do all the pages and transition shots and everything for the second one.
And that was years later, though, right?
Yeah, at that point, I wasn't working full-time at the animation studio. I came back to do that.
Oh, I was wondering about that because that was several years later. Did you do anything else while you were at Anavision that was interesting? I know they did that Tom Petty video, Running Down in Dream, but you didn't work on that, did you?
I think I was pretty much gone by then, too. There was like one sequence involving the sequence where he's on the building like King Kong or something that I did a couple of drawings for, but I wasn't as involved in the production stuff then. I think, like I said, I had moved on. I quit the animation studio when they offered me Spider-Man. During the time I was at the animation studio, I was working full-time at the animation studio, and that was during the time I was doing Ka-Zar. I did the 2 Indiana Jones fill-ins, my run on Star Wars, and my run on Marvel Team Up were all done while I was also working full-time at the animation studio.
Kind of getting now to Marvel, you had given Jim Shooter those pages, and then I think some time had gone by, maybe a year, possibly.
Yeah, all that work. I was working at the animation studio for almost a year when I got a phone call from my mom. I was still living at home, and she said, somebody named Al Milgrom called from Marvel and wants to talk to you. And I went, really? Okay. So she gave me the number, and I called, and I talked to Al Milgrom, and he handed the phone to Louise Jones, and that's how I got those first 2 Ka-Zar jobs. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was Ka-Zar 17. It was a fill-in issue, right? And how did that work? Did they work Marvel style, like give you a plot?
Well, Bruce Jones never did anything traditionally. So my first exposure to working for Marvel wasn't really working Marvel style. Bruce Jones would write these little short stories with no page breakdowns or anything, and it was your job to translate that into pictures. So it was a very different thing from even being working off a traditional Marvel plot. But with Louise there to hold my hand and walk me through it, I did what I was told. And I actually did 17 first, which was a very bizarre story where, what is it, like Ka-Zar thinks he's in a detective novel or something like that. I forget how that happens. He gets a concussion.
Yeah, that cover says Ka-Zar the detective on it. I remember it well because it was different.
Yeah, and he's altered somehow. I forget exactly what happens in the story, but he's altered and thinks he's living a detective novel that he was reading. So it was a test. I don't know if I served the story incredibly well, but got to the end of that one and turned it around fast enough that they said, well, we have issue 16 that we'd like you to do.
Right. And you did that
a little tighter deadline. And I went, okay. And that one was more traditional in the jungle, fighting monsters and things like that. So I was much more comfortable with that one.
Now, as far as that jumping around in the jungle and just kind of anatomic action hero, how did you feel about that? About just a character jumping around the pages that way?
Well, that's what I was comfortable with. I mean, anytime you can just do the human figure in motion with a manageable background, like a jungle setting or something like that, I think it's faster than, doing the thing with the detective novel was that the detective sequences were supposed to be set, like in the 30s and were supposed to be more noir. And those are the kinds of aspects that I'm not sure I served as well as I could have, because this was before the internet. And, you had to really dig for reference for different things back then, And I'm like, that's why I'm not sure I served that particular aspect of the story all that well. But I think most of us would admit, most freelance illustrators that work in comics would admit that if you gave us 2 guys in skin-tight costumes fighting each other in a white room, that would be our ultimate story.
Yeah.
If you didn't have to worry about backgrounds, if you just got to draw dynamic figures beating the crap out of each other, that's our sweet spot. That kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else is taxing us in one direction or the other,
Right. Was there any uncredited Marvel work before that, or it pretty much starts at Ka-Zar?
It pretty much starts at Ka-Zar. I did not start out ghosting for anybody or doing backgrounds for anybody or anything like that, no.
Then you did breakdowns for King Conan 12, is that right?
That is correct. That was the 3rd thing I did for Louise. And interestingly enough, after I did that, they offered me King Conan as a regular gig, but again, still working at the animation studio, and that being a double-sized story it might have been bi-monthly, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being very gun-shy to take a regular gig at that point. I was happy doing whatever they wanted me to do, but I was a little unsure about going on a regular gig. So I turned down King Conan. And then a little while later, they offered me Ka-Zar. Brent Anderson decided he was leaving Ka-Zar, and they offered me Ka-Zar. And at that point, God's honest truth, I probably would have rather done Conan than that version of Ka-Zar, but that horse was already out of the barn. But at that point, when they offered me Ka-Zar, I was afraid if I don't take this, they're going to stop offering things. So I took it. And that's how my stint on Ka-Zar happened.
That's how it started, yeah. Were you looking at any Tarzan stuff just for kind of reference?
No, not Tarzan. I was a huge Buscema fan, so I had all of his black and white Ka-Zar stories from that Savage Tales they were running in the 70s.
I gotcha.
And that was the stuff I was looking at, I think, the most. Even with Shanna, I was looking at some De Zuniga black and white stories that he did with Shanna. For the most part, my reference for my stuff on Ka-Zar was mostly the black and white Ka-Zar stuff and not even the color stuff that Buscema did,
Right. Yeah, the black and white magazines. So then you started doing, again, more non-superhero stuff. It was Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Marvel Saga. How did all that come about?
Just the way things do. People see that you're hitting your deadlines and see the work that you're doing and think you might be okay for this. I mean, Indiana Jones, again, was out of Louise's office. So at that point, Star Wars was out of Louise's office. So at that point, I was just one of Louise's guys, and she was kind of using me as a utility guy for fill-ins and such. The first thing I did for Star Wars was a framing sequence for a Kerry Gamble inventory story that they had. With Archie and Walt moving off the book, they were bringing in Mary Jo as a scripter, and they had done a Mary Jo, I guess, probably as a floater, as a test balloon, had done an inventory with Kerry Gamble. Of course, they had worked on Power Man Iron Fist together, or would. I don't know. I guess they had already. But anyway, they had this inventory story, and they needed a few pages to fit it into continuity. So that was the first thing I was asked to do for Star Wars before they offered it to me. And I was a big Star Wars fan. I loved Luke Skywalker, so that was a lot of fun for me. And the only postscript I would put on the Ka-Zar stuff is that I was a huge fan of Ka-Zar prior to the Bruce Jones stuff. And while I appreciated what Bruce Jones was doing with the character and that it was getting a lot of response from the readership, I didn't think Ka-Zar needed to be fixed. And I was constantly behind the scenes begging Louise Jones could we do a story that bridges how the Ka-Zar I remember so fondly from the old Ka-Zar stories became this Ka-Zar.
Right.
And Louise, thinking like an editor and not being worried about one fan crying in the wilderness, was going, Ron, nobody cares. This book is selling. We're doing fine. And I said, but, at one point there was even a reference where Shauna was talking to Peter Parker, which is, again, I got to do Spider-Man in Ka-Zar as well. She was talking to Peter Parker and said something about Ka-Zar struck her at one point, and he goes, Ka-Zar hit you? And she goes, yeah, all apes hit their mates. And I'm like, he's not an ape, man. He was raised by Zabu. He's a feral child, but he's not an ape, man.
That's funny.
And one scene where he's fighting the monster in my second issue, I liner noted, stronger than the mastodon, stronger than the giant boar, mighty as Ka-Zar, lord of the jungle. That was his thing, man. And I liner noted that, and they completely ignored it. And I'm going, oh, you're killing me. That would have been a nice little bridge from the guy I knew to this guy, and they were not it was one of those situations where they just weren't recognizing that the old Ka-Zar had any fans, and it was frustrating, but I certainly understood where Louise was coming from.
So,
Brent Anderson art,
did you have a favorite inker at this time? Like, did you like Tom Palmer's inks on your stuff?
Well, Tom Palmer, yes. I mean, anybody would love Tom Palmer. I liked what Armando Gil did over me for the most part. What I remember about Armando at the time is that he really wanted to pencil. And we had a couple of issues from him that were a little more slapdash than others. For the most part, he did beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. but we had a couple of issues where the editor wasn't as happy with what he was producing, but she knew it was because he was frustrated and he wanted to pencil. And when I left the title, he penciled, I think, maybe 1 or 2 issues before he realized penciling's really hard. and decided he was done already, So, I mean, Armando left comics. I don't know what he's doing now. I mean, he's a hell of an illustrator. So, I mean, I hope wherever he's doing, he's happy. But,
cool.
I enjoyed working with him. I liked him.
Now, you were doing all this from Pittsburgh, right? So you would essentially mail your stuff in.
Yeah, a lot of shipping through the post office and or FedEx. Yeah.
So at this point, were you wondering, like, okay, am I ever going to draw superheroes? Was that your preferred genre?
I was scared that I was not going to get to do superheroes. It was one of those things like, okay, I've shown them that I can function outside the superhero genre, but there's nothing I want to do more than superheroes. Mm-hmm. And so when Spider-Man showed up in Ka-Zar, I was happy as a clam, and I got to do some Spider-Man. And that's Tom DeFalco was the editor of Team Up at the time, and he saw the Spider-Man I did in Ka-Zar and thought, well, this guy doesn't screw up Spider-Man too badly, so maybe I can give him some fill-in stuff. I did an inventory issue of Marvel Team Up, which led to me being hired as the regular artist on Team Up, but it didn't seem like it because it was broken up with fill-ins, and then the team shifted pretty quickly to DeFalco giving up those titles and handing them to Danny, and that was when I was hired to do the regular book. So
you were doing the Marvel team-ups. You worked with writer Bill Mantlo, right, on a few of those issues? How was his style of collaboration with
well, he was doing, he was doing much more traditional Marvel plots. So I was thrilled finally working on traditional Marvel plots. Joe Duffy did traditional Marvel plotting and did some page breakdown and stuff, which was very helpful. And Joe really got me used to the traditional Marvel collaboration where, she would plot it to a point where you felt confident what you were doing visually, and then she enhanced that with her script. And I enjoyed working with Joe immensely. I learned everything I know about partnership and checking your ego at the door and trusting your partner I learned from Joe, because I never really had much interaction with Bruce Jones on Ka-Zar. He turned in his little short stories, and I did what I did with them, and that was pretty much that. So when I was working with Mantlo, I don't believe I ever had a phone conversation with Bill or anything, because I didn't really work on enough of his stories for it to matter. Mm-hmm. But, it was working traditional Marvel plot, so it was what I became used to working with Joe. So it was fairly seamless. I mean, I don't remember the stories I did with him being a problem of any kind. He put a lot into his stories. You got your money's worth if you were paying Bill Mantlo for a plot.
Right.
Because I remember the Kitty Pryde one I did had a lot of story to it. The Wonder Man one I did, I think, was Dave Michelini. The Jack of Hearts one, of course, was Bill Mantlo. That was his baby.
Was that a pain to draw, Jack of Hearts?
Oh, I love that character. I love that outfit.
Yeah, I do too.
Once you draw it once or twice, you get the pattern down, and it's not a problem at all. I've never really understood people complaining about that. I mean, that's the same people that complain about Jack of Hearts are the ones that complain about Spider-Man's webbing, and it's like, oh, boo-hoo, draw the damn webbing. If I had to complain about anything with Spider-Man, it's drawing New York City. every third panel you got to do a cityscape. That's where you complain about Spider-Man, not the webbing.
There you go, and that's funny. I haven't heard that before, but that does make sense. So then you did where Ka-Zar and Spidey team up, and then DeFalco saw your rendition of Spider-Man. So was it that there was this feeling of, okay, there's like a Romita Buscema vibe to this Spider-Man, and that resonated with DeFalco probably?
I think so, yeah. By the time I was a couple of issues in on the Ka-Zar stuff, I mean, I was fairly comfortable doing a kind of a Sal take on Spider-Man, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think they saw it as being pretty standard for what was going on at the time, and it was safe enough to hand it over. Of course, what they didn't suspect until The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, which I did before I was awarded the series, what they weren't expecting was that if I got to do more Spider-Man, I was going to pull out my Ditko. And so when I turned in the pencils on The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, there was some consternation about some of the reverse webbing on the mask and all that kind of stuff. There was some consideration about having it fixed. And this was all, pre-Todd McFarlane, of course. They didn't, to their credit, they didn't fix it, and it landed pretty well with the audience. So, I mean, it's a fantastic story. I mean, Roger, that's all due to Roger. All I had to do was stay out of the way and let the story tell itself.
Right. So now, once you then got offered Spidey as a regular gig, that's when you decided to leave Anavision, right?
Indeed. I sat down with my boss and had a long conversation with him. Freelance is freelance, but through paying my taxes those couple of years that I was doing both, it became clear that, working in Anavision was kind of paying the taxes on what I was doing for Marvel. And that even though I would be freelance, if they were offering me a regular monthly title, that's about as stable as you get in the comics industry. And they were offering me The Amazing Spider-Man. So unless I screwed up, I thought about turning it down because I didn't think I was ready. But then it occurred to me that I could be relied upon to give 110% to what I was producing because of my love of the character. And it would have been hard for me to not take it, and then whoever did take it kind of watch them do those stories. I mean, that would have, I don't think I could have survived that, to tell you the truth. So I closed my eyes and jumped and said yes. So
nice.
So, Ron, I want to clarify a couple of points about that. So you were initially hired to fill in for John Romita Jr. while he set up X-Men, right? And you were going to do like 6 issues?
That is true.
Now, was the Kid Who Collects Spider-Man one of those 6 issues, or did that come before that?
That was prior.
A couple of issues?
That was prior. I had also done.
Being offered.
No, I was never offered Spider-Man like, would you like the book, until we were a few issues into the run. And it became clear that JR had a conversation with Danny and decided that he wasn't coming back and go ahead and give it to us.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't leave the animation studio until you knew that you had the ongoing gig?
The idea that they were offering me Spider-Man work was making me feel like, okay, I can do this.
There you go.
It was their masthead character, for God's sakes, and so at that point it was supposed to be a 6-issue run, but I had no reason to believe that I wouldn't be safe on like Marvel Team Up or something else, because I had already done a What If with Spider-Man, and I had already done a What If with the FF working with Senate, and I mean there was just all this. I was becoming more and more useful to them. Some of which I was able to turn around breakdowns quickly. I mean, they pretty early on shifted me to breakdowns because they liked my storytelling and were more concerned with getting these books laid out and onto the inker and stuff. So for the longest time, I thought that would be my role. I would be kind of like a utility Sal guy, that kind of thing. And I was fine with it, but I had every reason to believe that would lead to more work. It wasn't until we were a few issues in on Spider-Man, and we knew that it was going to be a regular gig, that Danny had me doing full pencils, but Rubinstein was more comfortable working on layouts. And initially, Danny, God love him, said, no, I hired Ron to do full pencils. He's going to do full pencils. But my attitude was, if Joe would rather do breakdowns, then I'll do the breakdowns. Because if he's seeing this differently than me, he's feeling limited by my full pencils, and he's not completely using my full pencils. So we're talking about wasted effort. And I said, I'll go to breakdowns. He'll be happier. We'll all be happier with the finished product. And that's what we ended up doing for the lion's share of the run. But
when you did the Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, let's talk about that for a few minutes, because people still must ask you about that story, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's wonderful that it's still remembered as the way it is, yeah.
Did you get a script from Roger Stern, or how did you first get that?
Plot.
And what did you think when you read it?
It was a traditional Marvel plot that I think the sections written by the reporter were scripted. I think he had those, and he told you where they were going to fall in the storytelling and everything. I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I choked up when I read the plot the same way people choke up when they read the story, and I was incredibly intimidated. I had already done some Ditko on Spider-Man on the What If I had done, because what I tried to do on the What If, which is It comes through to a certain degree, but I'm not sure that the inker, and Sam De La Rosa, I'm not sure he had the time to worry about what I was trying to do in the pencils with that job, because those What If jobs were larger than normal. But on that Spider-Man What If, it transitioned between the Ditko and the Romita eras. So I tried to reflect that in the pencils. And again, I'm not sure Mr. De La Rosa had time to worry about that as he was inking it. I don't know what his deadline was like, but I don't know if it comes through in the book as much, but there is a transition where I went from trying to draw more of a Ditko Peter Parker to drawing more of a Romita Parker and blah, blah, blah. So while I was doing that book, I became very enamored of what Ditko had done on Spider-Man. And the thing that was a challenge I felt for the kid who collects Spider-Man is that Spider-Man doesn't actually do much in it. He stands around and he talks to Tim, and there are some flashback shots of him moving spiderily and stuff, but for the most part, he's in this room talking to this kid. And I'm going, well, how do you make him in that room talking to the kid? You could do him hanging from the ceiling or something, but that didn't seem as warm as having the kid on his lap and everything. And what I came upon is, if you do Ditko, he's Spider-Man, even if he's just standing there. The way
Absolutely.
Ditko would just have him cock his hip and stand there, that's Spider-Man,
Right.
So that's why I really wanted to go full Ditko. Now I'm hearing Robert Downey Jr. go, you never go full Ditko.
Yeah, it's funny.
I tried going full Ditko, and what really worked on that issue, that story, is Terry Austin's work.
I was going to ask you that. Did you talk to him after you did the pencils?
No, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with Terry, to tell you the truth. But he really helped reinforce the Ditko feel to that thing. I think that's one of the things.
Well, that's interesting. You didn't give him a note. You didn't say, I'm really going for, well, it's obvious you were going for.
Well, it was pretty obvious in the pencils what I was going for. And I mean, he's a very perceptive man. So, but he didn't change the webbing. He didn't fix anything, quote unquote, fix anything. And he embraced that. And his own line, he always had that almost like a wedge point line with the brush that was very similar to a lot of what Ditko would do with the way he would outline figures and stuff. And it just ended up working. I mean, to this day, that's still, if Marvel would ever approach me, or if anybody would approach me about what I would want, nobody's ever going to do a Ron Frenz Visionaries, but if they did,
that would be there.
I would still want that in there, because it's still something I'm very, very proud of.
Now, you're about to start the regular run on Spider-Man. Did you get a call from Tom DeFalco saying, hey, here's what I got in mind for what we got ahead of us? Tell us about how you guys kind of linked up, because I think you've mentioned that you've described him as the other half of your brain before. Oh,
creatively, very much so, yeah. I had met Tom before we ever worked together. I met him at a convention here in Pittsburgh. He and Jackson Geis, and he was just Butch Geis back then, was working on Micronauts. And the three of us went out to dinner and just had a wonderful time talking and laughing about comics and what we loved and what we didn't love. And he was still doing kind of a Mike Golden riff on Micronauts that he obviously started to move away from. And so I was kidding him about being the replacement Mike Golden on Micronauts, and he was kidding me about being the third Buscema brother, the least famous Harpo Buscema, that kind of thing. And so we were going back and forth, joking with each other on that. And DeFalco, he and I remember having conversations with him where we talked about what our favorite Hulk personality was and how we felt about the Marvel style of bombast and the hoo-ha action, as Tom calls it. Yeah. And we were just very on page for that kind of stuff. So when he called me to hire me on Team Up, we had a bunch of conversations. And one of the conversations we had early on is he said, I'm going to be a pain in the ass. And I said, how do you mean? And he said, well, I'm going to let you know what I think about what you're doing, and I'm going to make pointers. And I said, Tom, that's fine. As much as I loved working for Louise, and you'll never hear me say a bad word about Louise Jones. She's just incredible as an editor and as a person. I didn't get a lot of that feedback unless I specifically asked for it.
Right.
I kind of felt a little bit thrown into the deep end, because if Marvel hired you at that point in the 80s, it's because they thought you could do the work and they needed you to do the work and they needed you to hit your deadlines. And so they just kind of pushed you into the pool and you swam or sank on your own. Okay.
Yes.
So I was very open to whatever feedback Tom wanted to get me, incredibly open to that. What was funny about that is, like I said, a lot of that stuff was during the transition between he and Danny Fingeroth. And the first team-up story I did it for Tom. It was the Wonder Man story by Dave Michelinie. And I had done it for Tom as inventory, and it was sitting in a drawer, but it didn't see print until after Danny was the editor, right? And Danny was our editor on the Spider-Man book. And at one point he called me because he wanted a couple of sequences redrawn from the Wonder Man story, that he felt that some of the storytelling could be a little clearer and all this kind of stuff. And one of the sequences that he wanted redrawn was one of those multiple image sequences of Spider-Man jumping around the room. There was like this danger room sequence in this issue where Spider-Man had to dodge all these different things that were there to test this armor, right? And Tom wanted to do it as a single shot with multiple images of Spider-Man jumping around. And that's the way I did it. And Tom approved it, and it was sitting in the drawer. Danny wanted all of that redrawn. So when Tom was, talking about what a hard ass he was and everything, I said, hey, hard ass, I just had to redraw pages from a job that you accepted. And he goes, what job? And I told him, and he went, son of a bitch, really? And so Danny was a bigger pain in my ass than Tom ever was. But Danny was a very hands-on editor. Danny worried about every comma and every period. And, to his credit, he was an incredibly engaged editor.
Oh, cool.
I mean, there were times, early on in the Spider-Man run, Danny was going on vacation. This was before everybody had cell phones, right? He was stopping at like every payphone on the way to his vacation to call me about, I just wanted to clarify. Do you understand what I'm saying on this note here? And I'm going, Danny, I got it. That kind of thing. There was one time we were on a conference call. There was DeFalco and myself and Danny. And Tom and I finally had to gang up on him and just say, Danny, it works. It's okay. I mean, he would ask for panels to be redrawn, and then he'd have somebody in the office do a correction on the redrawn panel. I mean, it was like, the guy was amazing. I mean, you got to give him his due, I mean,
highly detailed.
Yeah, I mean, and you're going to pay an editor to do the job. You don't want somebody that's just a traffic manager. You want somebody that's engaged, that is really paying attention. As big a pain in the ass as it can be, that's what you want an editor to do, Right.
There's that interesting mix of crafting it till it's finally done. And is there some neurosis or anxiety there or not? But the final product is good. So there it is.
Well, that's ultimately, and even in that one conversation, Tom and I were more concerned about, can we just move on to the next problem? It works. Let's settle for it works right now.
It works.
Okay?
Yeah.
It might not be perfect. We'll worry about perfect next issue. It works. Let's move on.
It's interesting. So this is kind of the beginning of you essentially putting the star character in new costumes, like the black costume in issue 252. You also did the Eric Masterson Thor costume, and then even the blue Superman. So, what did you think of the black suit when you first saw it? And also, was there a discussion in the beginning that it was going to be an alien later?
DeFalco came up with the fact that it was an alien. So I don't necessarily remember him bouncing that off of me, because that was stuff that we were dealing with pretty quickly in the books. When I first saw the black costume, I thought it was a bad guy. They sent me a plot and some Mike Zeck drawings of the costume, and I thought it was a new villain because I hadn't read the plot yet. And I said, well, this new villain looks kind of cool. And they said, that's not a new villain. That's Spider-Man's new suit.
Yeah.
And I went, son of a bitch.
Right when you got the book. Yeah.
25 years I've waited to draw Spider-Man. And when I get here, he's not Spider-Man anymore. I mean, I like the design. I thought it was fine. The two issues that Leonardi did, I think, really helped me get a handle on it.
I mean, it's easier to draw too, right? Because it's like solid black.
You would think that. You would think that, but, if you look at how many people draw those damn legs wrong, to this day, it depends on whether or not you're paying attention, because
that's funny.
everybody draws the fucking legs wrong. Pardon my French. Because people always said that. Well, at least you don't have to draw the webbing. And more people draw the webbing right than draw that damn spider right, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, sometimes it looks like a lobster or something like that, right? So that's true.
Yeah,
So,
especially, and that was one of the things that Leonardi brought to it, because originally it only had like one break in the legs. It came up and then down, and it just had the one break, and it kind of fanned out from the top of the body. And what Leonardi brought to it that really I think works, it makes it look more organic, makes it look more like a spider, is that second break in the leg. But that's where everybody has trouble, is where that break is, and how
that's funny.
How it sits on the chest and how it goes around his rib cage. And I mean, some people just draw it like it's a friggin' lightning bolt going around his rib cage or something, and it's not supposed to be.
In these issues, this is where you and DeFalco, you co-created like so many characters together, but in this run, a couple characters come to mind. Puma, who you guys introduced in 256, you co-created Silver Sable in 265. Were you guys having like phone calls on how these characters would get visually fleshed out? How was that?
Well, the phone calls we were having, because that was one of the questions a few minutes ago, Tom made it clear for whatever the duration of our stint was that he wanted to create new characters and not use the classics. And I said, okay. And then he bought the infamous animal cards from late night television, and from the late night animal cards came Black Fox, Silver Sable, Puma. Right. I think that's it. I think those are the main ones. So Black Fox showed up in our first, we did 251 and 252. We did off of a plot by Roger Stern. Yes. And then he did 253, 254 with Rick Leonardi. And then we started with 255. So, yeah. Where in the run we found out that JR wasn't coming back, I could not tell you. All I can tell you is that Danny told me that JR came into the office and was looking through the pages, and Danny liked what Tom and I were doing, so we were at least a few issues in, and that Danny said, so when are you coming, but you're still coming back, right? Because if you're coming back, we're going to stick by the deal. Right. And that JR said, you seem to be really happy with what they're doing. And he goes, yeah, I'm very happy with what they're doing. That's not the point. If you're still coming back, we're going to stick by the deal. And JR said, just give it to him. I got my hands full with the X-Men. I'm fine. And Danny called and said, we're in. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Now, where in the run that happened, I don't know. But I know that it happened. And the first time I met JR in person, I thanked him for my run on Spider-Man. So, because he let's say like for example, the look of Puma. How much detail were you getting from Tom on the actual appearance, and how much of that was your interpretation, and then adding your own stuff into it? Like, was it pretty much 50? Puma wasn't 50-50 because Tom had a very set idea what he wanted for Puma. I actually did a Facebook post on this at one point and showed some of the early designs. My first design for Puma was very much a person with long black hair, long straight black hair, like an American Indian with a helmet, bare chested and all this kind of stuff, with a helmet that looked like a puma, that kind of thing. And Tom said, no, I really do want to go more wear Puma, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I see.
And he says, I want him to change. So I did a couple other designs, some where he was too cat-like, and Tom said, can we find somewhere between this and this? And I said, okay, well, I know where you're going, okay. And I came up with the original outfit. I called in a friend of mine, Richie Anazeski, who really helps me out anytime I need to design new characters. And he came up with some nice Indian-looking artifacts and stuff for the costume that I thought worked really well. And we did the initial costume. I didn't do a color sketch because I hadn't created a lot of characters up to that point. These days, when I'm designing a character now, I almost always do it in full color.
Full color,
There are some exceptions, but for the most part, I mean, on Blue Baron, I've done color sketches for almost all the characters. Some of the more minor characters I haven't, and Glenn Whitmore does the coloring himself, but for the most part, if it's a main character, I'll do the design in color. But back then I wasn't doing that. And the colors they came up with worked fine, but what I wasn't happy with in the initial costume was that there was some confusion as to what was his own fur and what was part of the costume.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted it to be much clearer as to what was supposed to be. Like the stuff at his shoulders was supposed to be part of the costume. And I would have colored that red and not close to the orange of his own fur, that kind of thing. So that's why when he appeared later, I simplified the costume so that anything you were seeing was pretty obviously his fur, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did do a color sketch for that one. But yeah, so Tom had a very set idea what he had. The costume he left up to me, but the design of the actual character was very much Tom. Silver Sable, he kind of left up to me. I think it was his idea to have her be petite, though. One of the things that kind of got lost in that game of telephone was that she was only supposed to be like 5'1" or 5'2" or something.
Oh, okay.
At the time, I was actually living with and engaged to a young woman who was 5 foot even. So I was actually drawing her like she was like 5 foot even because I loved the idea of her ordering around these big mercenary guys who were all like 6 foot, that kind of thing. Because even Spider-Man's supposed to be like 5'10".
Right.
And so I drew her short, but when she went off on her own and got her own series and stuff, that's one of those things that kind of gets lost in the translation sometimes. And she was supposed to look very much like Marilyn Monroe.
That was basically in the Bible of the character. Okay.
Yeah, well, no, that was me.
Oh, that was you. There you go.
Bible covered all the stuff like what country she was from and the Wild Pack and the uncle that she had early on and all those characters, I mean, he left the actual look. The only thing that was changed from the original look was since we had Black Cat at the time and she was a regular in the strip, my original drawings of Silver Sable had platinum blonde hair. I was still using a little bit of yellow in her hair to make it look like platinum blonde hair because Black Cat had white hair with light blue on it. Because it makes sense somebody named Silver Sable would have silver hair, but I didn't think of that. I didn't think that was a really good idea with Black Cat. I was overridden by editorial. They said, no, that's ridiculous. Her name's Silver Sable. She's got silver hair. I went, okay. So there you go.
That makes sense.
Who's left? Black Fox.
Black Fox, yeah.
He was the older guy. He was supposed to be, reaching retirement, so I gave him the white mustache. And in his first appearance, he pretty much just wore a black bodysuit. When he appeared later, I added some, like a backpack for him to carry his booty in and things like that. But, I mean, for the most part, he was just wearing a black bodysuit. So
yeah,
he wasn't much of a challenge. I liked drawing the character, though. I thought he had a very expressive face.
So Shooter had that incentive program. So you received a piece of those character appearances. How did were there new character agreements? Was there a form for that or what,
yes.
Or was it just, tell me how that worked?
Oh, they were all over you to fill out the paperwork anytime you created a new character.
Yeah. Okay.
And since DeFalco was in the office, he did his share to make sure that I always filled out the new character agreements and stuff. So,
oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
When DeFalco said we're going to do new characters, was that entirely a creative decision, or was it also, hey, we're going to create characters that we actually have some piece of?
My guess would be it was mostly a creative decision because he had just gone through Roger doing Hobgoblin to kind of resuscitate the whole Green Goblin concept.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I'm going to go ahead and give him the credit because he's more than earned it, that it wasn't about making himself any richer. It was about, he always likes to move forward. He'd always rather do new ideas rather than recycle old ideas. If you look at his Fantastic Four run, whether you love it or hate it, it wasn't traditional Fantastic Four stories.
No, it was not.
There you go. See? So I think that was, creatively, he tends to just be a person that would rather create than recycle. When we would do later projects, like when we did the Spider-Man 96 annual, he went, okay, Ron, what character would you like to do that you never got to do? I said, Craven. And he said, okay, we'll do Craven. And then he came up with a fantastic story, flashback story, because what we had talked about wanting to do was the actual moment that George Stacy realized Peter Parker was Spider-Man.
Oh, that's cool.
And it worked out for it to be right there in that period of time where Craven was working for Green Goblin and all that kind of stuff. So it worked out great. I got to do Craven. when we did the 2-issue Web Spinners story that wrapped up that series, he says, what character would you like to do? What villain? Is there a villain you'd like to do that we never got to do? And I got to do Doc Ock. Plus, I also got to do a whole bunch of other. We did the Sinister Syndicate again, so I got to do those guys again.
The Sinister Six?
The Sinister Syndicate.
Oh, Syndicate. Okay.
Yeah, and the only reason that the Rhino was redesigned at all under my watch was because Jim Owsley insisted on it.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted the Rhino to become more like a transformer. So maybe he was picturing something more like what was in Amazing Spider-Man 2. I don't know. But I was desperately trying to keep it organic. And the only thing I could think of that wasn't already a part of the Rhino was if you see a real Rhino, there's these plates under the skin that look a little more obvious from different angles. And I said, well, what if I just add those and put some studs on them and shit? Maybe that'll be enough. And, and it was. I just kind of went hallelujah, because I really didn't want to do them mechanical, that kind of thing.
And with DeFalco, you guys were pretty much working Marvel style, right? With this,
always
with DeFalco. Now,
we would have hours long conversations where we would talk about Pete and make sure we were all on the same page with who Peter Parker was, and talk about his relationships with all of his supporting cast, and we would talk about his relationships with his villains, and we'd talk about how he feels about what he does. His relationship with Aunt May and all this kind of stuff. We would just have these long conversations about that kind of stuff. And in the course of that, plots would suggest themselves. And
cool.
And Tom's terrific at writing, in my opinion, is terrific at writing gangster stuff, street level mafioso type manipulation and stuff. So he and Rick Leonardi had created the Rose, who was kind of like middle management and all that kind of stuff. And I just loved watching his brain work when it came to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like that character too.
That's right. He started, he's the one that got Frank Miller really moving in that direction with Daredevil.
I have heard those stories from the horse's mouth, yes, that he handed him some old crime paperbacks and everything and was really kind of the one that planted that seed in Frank Miller. Yeah. Yeah.
So now that one Spider-Man Annual 18 in 1984, you did a story with Stan Lee, right?
Yeah, that was Stan scripted it. Yes.
Did he do that one Marvel style, or did he send you a script, or how did that work out?
Well, DeFalco plotted it, so for me it was just like working off a regular DeFalco plot.
I see, and then Stan scripted it.
We actually discussed this on Facebook. I'm not sure we knew. At the time I was penciling it, I'm not even sure we knew Stan was scripting it yet. So I don't remember being scared shitless that I was penciling for Stan.
Right, after the fact.
I do remember that Danny got a very nice letter from Stan that mentioned me, and Danny sent me a copy of it.
That's nice.
That Stan mentioned me, that he enjoyed working with my stuff and thought that I had that my storytelling was solid and all that kind of jazz. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That one issue, the Spidey versus Firelord, and Spidey just loses his temper and bashes Firelord's face in and wins. That had some nice visceral emotion in that. How did it feel putting that story together?
I loved it. I mean, Tom very obviously wanted to do something along the lines of what Roger and JR had done with Juggernaut. And he wanted to put Spider-Man up against somebody out of his weight class, obviously out of his weight class. And I thought it worked great. It's one of my favorite sequences because in the course of the story, at the end of part 1, it tells you everything you need to know about who Peter Parker is. Because at one point he's going, you know what? He's looking for Spider-Man. He's not looking for me. All I got to do is change to Peter Parker and disappear into the crowd. But then as he's changing, his wallet falls open to a shot of him and Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and he goes, what am I doing? If I disappear, he could go nuts and he could hurt innocent people. This is my problem. I can't walk away from this. So he remasks up and says, I'm going to give him the fight of his life. I'm going to do what I can, give him the fight of his life. Yeah. And that's what he did. What's funny to me now in retrospect is because I belong to a bunch of these different Facebook page groups and stuff. you get notified when your name comes up, so I'll go check some of these conversations. And this always comes up. Those two issues always come up as like either the best Spider-Man story ever because I just cheered for Spider-Man and thought it was wonderful, or yeah, but it was BS because there's no way Spider-Man could beat Firelord. And not only does he beat him, he just beats him by punching him out.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, he doesn't. Read the story. A gas station blows up, takes out a city block and blows up right under Firelord. A building falls on top of him. Is dynamited and falls on top of him. I mean, you know, Spider-Man is throwing everything he can at this guy. So it's not just that because I would even argue that he doesn't just get mad and jump at Firelord. He's just desperate. He's at that point, it's all or nothing. I got to leave it all on the mat, and he just goes crazy on him. But you know, even that was on top of everything else that happened to Firelord that day. You know,
right?
So, and ultimately, if you read the follow up in Avengers, he's out for all of 10 minutes. You know, I mean, it's not like Spider-Man beat him up. You know, that kind of thing.
Now,
so
you also did some X Factor covers during this time. How'd that come about exactly?
That's a very good question. I don't know what the reasoning would have been. Who is the editor on? Was Wheezy the editor on that? Because at that point, I didn't find this out until later, but my covers were actually going over pretty well in the office.
Huh?
I was told way after the fact, I was told that they would get together with Mark Grunwald would have these meetings with the associate editors and the assistant editors, and they would discuss different aspects of editing, and they would put all the covers for the month up on the wall, and they would say, you know, they would pick the best of the month and all this stuff, and that my stuff was doing well in that kind of a process. And I think that's why when I was on Thor, I know Ralph Macchio really liked my covers on Thor, so his other two books were Captain America and Fantastic Four, and he said, how would you like to do my covers on those too?
Louise was the writer, actually, and then Bob Harris was the editor. That's probably
Bob Harris, okay. Yeah, I mean, it may have just come about from that, because I also did their corner box shots and stuff, so I don't really know why, because I've never really done much X work, so I don't remember any specifics about it. But yeah, I enjoyed doing those covers for the brief time I was doing.
Because you were the Spider-Man and then obviously the Thor guy. So it's interesting that you were actually knocking out some X Factor covers. But I think maybe the office was thinking, you know, this guy draws such good and genuine Marvel style that they're just really trying to make those covers pop, right?
Probably as much as anything. And I tended to suggest, they didn't always use it, but I tended to suggest cover copy and things like that. And Ralph Macchio let me do all my own cover copy on Thor. I mean, he would occasionally edit it, of course, and Captain America, you know, and even the Fantastic Four covers. He liked the fact that because at the time, DeFalco's belief was, and he was editor-in-chief during some of that period. I don't know what Shooter's idea about it was specifically, but Tom DeFalco's idea was if there was any cover copy at all, that was a good thing, because if you had to stop even for a second to read the cover copy, that was a couple of seconds that you were spending looking at that cover, and that increased the possibility that you would buy that comic, you know, that kind of thing.
So, Ron, before we move on from Spider-Man, I wanted to ask you about some of the inkers you worked with. One of the first ones was Klaus Janson. Your thoughts about him?
I just thought I was blessed because everybody already knew the kind of work that he did and how good he was and how he would suggest coloring if he didn't color it himself. And I think Christy colored some of that. Christy Shield colored those issues. But I just felt like the deeper I got into the Marvel stuff. Once I was on Star Wars with Tom Palmer, I felt like I was a Marvel guy. Once I had done the Fantastic Four What If, inked by Joe Sinnott, I felt like I was a Marvel guy. So the more I got paired with inkers whose work I knew, who were name guys, I felt like you automatically feel more protected. You feel like the work is going to look its best, when it's going to fix the things you did wrong, and it's going to make you look even more like you knew what you were doing, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
they had an amazing stable of inkers at this point, because after Jansen,
and most of them were finishers.
Oh yeah, besides Rubinstein, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Brett Breeding did a fair number of your pencils on Spider-Man too. What about him?
I love Brett's stuff. I always have. I remember being in art school and seeing his work over Bob Hall on the West Coast Avengers miniseries. I know when I found out that Brett was going to ink 252, that's what got the rise out of most of my comic book nerd friends was, wow, you're working with Brett Breeding. He hates to hear that story. He doesn't believe it, but it's true.
Bob McLeod did some on your stuff?
Yeah. Bob tends to, being a penciler himself, he tends to rework some of the pencil stuff and everything, but you can't argue with the finished product. The finished product always looks fantastic.
Bob Layton?
Well, I really only worked with Bob on some of the Jameson Wedding Annual. So half of that was inked by Butch Geis and half of it was inked by Bob. I don't remember having any problem with the Bob stuff.
But another guy that's a penciler too.
Yeah, I don't remember him, over changing anything. I might even be torn on. It's been a while since I've looked at the job. I might not even be able to tell who did what. I probably could, because Butch's stuff had a bit of a thinner line and was a little looser. But yeah, again, like I said, I got into this business knowing that it was highly collaborative, and you were going to be at the tender mercies of the finisher.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you have any inkers where you thought it was doing a disservice to your work?
Probably along the way. The only one that leaps to mind, and it's only, let me say that this is only because it was my first job, but the gentleman that inked my very first Ka-Zar, there were shots that I didn't think he serviced very well. There were face expressions that I don't think he serviced very well.
Okay.
And those were, and you're looking at that from an angle of like, this isn't just my next comic or whatever. It was my very, very first. It was my second, actually.
Oh, right.
So I found myself a bit crestfallen, looking at it. Certainly looking at it and going, well, I'm never going to get hired again would have been overstating it. And again, it was only because it was so early in my career. But yeah, there have been ink jobs over what have I been in this business, 30 some years. There have definitely been ink jobs I've liked more than others. And there are some that I would have preferred somebody else gotten them or something. But, you don't have that call. You don't, you take the good with the bad. My good has been incredibly good. So for me to piss and moan about some of the not so good would be ridiculous. It would be insincere.
So is Rubinstein one of your all-time favorites?
I would work with Joe anytime. Yeah. I don't, he does bring a lot of his own style to it. So I will say this, I prefer working with Joe if I'm not doing full pencils, because again, the job will always look professional. It's like with Tom Palmer on Star Wars. I was only doing breakdowns, but my version of what Luke Skywalker looked like and what Lando Calrissian looked like, and Tom already had in his head, he already had a template for who Luke and Lando were, okay? They didn't always line up with what I was trying to do, but he was the final look of the book. That was his job. My job was to tell the story in pictures. His job was to finish it. And so you get used to it. You say, okay, that's his job, so I need to shut up and let him do his job. When I'm working with Joe Rubinstein, it can be very similar because he brings so much of his own technique and style to everything from musculature to facial structure to all this kind of stuff, that I am happier working with Joe when I'm just doing breakdowns, because then I don't feel like we're clashing. I feel like we're blending. If I'm doing less and letting him do it, then I have no reason to feel like I'm being overruled or anything. You understand what I mean?
Oh, yeah. We interviewed him, and he was drawing while we were interviewing him. He never stopped, I don't think.
From what I understand, he draws constantly. He's an incredible illustrator. His portrait work is incredible. The guy's amazing. He has, his talent is so far beyond just what he does on a comic page, then it's very impressive to me. He's Joe Rubinstein. I mean, we had some wonderful conversations when we were working together on Spider-Man. We had some wonderful late-night conversations and stuff. So, and again, I worked with him on Superman, and I was only doing breakdowns on Superman, so that worked great. I thought he was doing some terrific stuff, and he saved my ass on that stuff. And I've worked with him a few times since on different projects.
One other question on inking, and then I'll move on. When you do your full pencils, who would be your favorite ideal inker to do it once you've done your full pencils?
Well, if you're talking, I mean, because Brett Breeding is going to be my answer in almost every case, because Brett and I we're close enough friends that Brett doesn't have a problem if I have some input on what he's doing. I hope not anyway. I mean, but I love what Brett does over my work. If you're talking about the person that I could full pencil a page, hand it off, and know I'm going to get back exactly what I just full penciled, that would be Mr. Sal Buscema. Because Sal and I are very much hand in glove. I learned most of what I know about Marvel illustration from looking at Sal's work.
Oh, that's awesome.
He really just he understands my shorthand like nobody else. You know, he just gets it. We're speaking the same visual language in a way that I don't think he ever lays a line down where he might not have done that himself. You know what I mean? So we just understand each other. I mean, there have been times, you know, at one point I was looking at reference when we were on Spider-Girl together, I was looking at reference of ballet dancers and gymnasts and the way they point their toes. And I was trying to include that into some of my Spider-Girl positioning. And on some of the angles, like when she's coming at you and things like that, they just kind of look like little wedges coming at you. And Sal said, "What's this thing you're doing with the feet now?" And I explained it. I explained to him what I was doing, and he went, "Don't do that." I went, "Okay, well, if Sal Buscema tells you to stop, you should probably stop."
Oh, that's great. So when did Jim Owsley become editor over the Spider-Man titles?
The transition was around the time of the Firelord two-parter. Danny edited the Firelord two-parter, but as soon as Owsley came on board, my pencils, my Xeroxes of my pencils of the Firelord two-parter are numbered differently than the issues it ran in, because my understanding was that Owsley pulled it out of the regular rotation because there was talk about it either making it a graphic novel or a special one-shot or some craziness. I don't know what it was, but in the meantime, he ran fill-ins. And the next issue would come out, it'd be a fill-in, and I'd call it DeFalco, and I'd go, "What's going on?" And he said, "Last I heard, blah, 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 he's walking around with this thing under his arm, figuratively or literally, I don't know. But it didn't run when it was supposed to run, and it made it look like Tom and I couldn't make a deadline or something, you know."
Oh, that's interesting. Because didn't he complain at some point that you guys missed deadlines?
A lot of what he said in defense of firing us was unfortunately disputed by other sources.
I see, yeah.
The only two things I'll say about that whole controversy is that Tom DeFalco never missed a deadline in his life, and that Spider-Man was my dream gig. There was no way I was giving it up without a fight.
Yeah.
And whenever he would give us a new deadline, I would meet it. What was going on in the office at the time, what his personal frustrations might have been, and what he was trying to attempt, I don't know. You know, I can't really speak directly to that. I know that he liked the other Spider-Man books at the time better than ours. I was at a Spider-Man summit where he referred to Tom and Mai's work on Amazing as the bland corporate Spider-Man.
That's crazy.
Well, he loved what Peter David and Rich Buckler and Brett Breeding were doing on the Death of Jean DeWolf and everything. He loved that. He loved the Web of Spider-Man stuff, Michelini and I think it was Silvestri and Kyle Baker or something. You know, he loved Beecham. He loved when Beecham did Spider-Man. He thought that was the greatest thing in the world because he was giving Mark Beecham a lot of work. So he had a very set idea of what he thought Spider-Man should be. And as editor, that's his prerogative. You know, it's his prerogative to make that so. And even his version is that he kind of came up with reasons that don't necessarily hold water as to why Tom couldn't do a monthly book, because that's just not so. But he even tries to say that he wanted to start like a quarterly book that would just be Tom and Ron doing their bland corporate Spider-Man to their heart's content, that kind of thing, which of course never happened. But so it was just a very confusing, bizarre time. I mean, like I said, if you put a whole bunch of people in a room, which Glenn Greenberg did an article for Back Issue Magazine about the Hobgoblin mess up and all that kind of stuff and what went on. And Jim Owsley's version of events are unique and unto themselves. Nobody else's version lines up with Jim's version. This is the one thing I'll say. And
I read where he described you as being fanatical about Spider-Man. Did he?
Yeah.
Did he ever tell you that?
No, he did say in his essay, because I read some of the stuff on his website, and he did say in his essay that he worried that I was going to commit suicide when he fired me, which was never a concern. But when on the commentary, on the comments, and when he wrote that thing on his blog, the comments were, well, if Ron Frenz is that crazy, he should go ahead and kill himself. That very supportive stuff from the fans.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wonderfully supportive stuff from the fans. If indeed he was concerned about that, thank you, but it was never going to be that,
Right, that was never the concern. Yeah.
No, I never considered jumping out a window, and I've only heard this secondhand. This could have been Tom just being supportive, but I will say that in the phone conversation, somehow Jim turned it around to the point where he actually said the words, "I don't expect anybody to feel sorry for me." And my brain I was reeling at the moment, but I said, "Feel sorry for you?" Because he had to make the tough call, that kind of thing. So in the course of firing me from my dream job, he did manage to kind of make it about himself. Tom DeFalco, I think, half-jokingly says that when Owsley said, told Tom that he was fired, that he said, "Is there anything I can do?" And Tom said, "You could jump out that window right now." And then Owsley said, "Well, so that's the way it's going to be?" And then Tom said, "Well, you could wait until Ron Frenz has time to fly here from Pittsburgh so we can both piss on your corpse." Now, that's completely uncalled for. I do not, that's completely uncalled for and never should have been said.
That's hilarious.
And quite frankly, let me fast forward a couple of years ahead. And when Jim Owsley came back to Marvel and started writing Conan under Tom DeFalco, who was editor-in-chief,
Yeah.
Tom was helping him co-plot those things. Tom was the guy who rehired Jim Owsley.
Wow.
Right.
I didn't know that.
Because he heard he was driving bus and that all that kind of, and the guy's a hell of a writer. I mean, the stuff he did on Black Panther, nobody's going to argue with that stuff. The guy knows. No,
change the
stuff.
characters. Great.
Yeah, he knows his shit. I mean, he's a solid writer. So Tom could recognize that. Tom wasn't, it's not about grudge. Like I said, I don't know what was motivating Jim Owsley, because he's not even Jim Owsley anymore. So I can't speak to what was going on with Jim Owsley. In his blog, he talks about all the pressures he was under. I think he was under a lot of pressure. I don't think he should have been hired. I mean, Jim Shooter broke his cardinal rule of hiring an editor when he hired Jim Owsley, because his cardinal rule of hiring an editor was you hire your editor who knows what they're doing and you stand back and you let them do it. Okay? But when he hired Jim Owsley, because he was very impressed with him as a writer, when he hired Jim Owsley as editor, if anybody said to him, "Mr. Shooter, what are you doing?" He doesn't have that enough experience. Jim Shooter's answer, and I heard him say this firsthand, was, "I'm not worried about it because all the writers on the Spider-Man titles are editors themselves. Louise is an editor. She was writing Web. Al Milgrom was doing Peter Parker. He is also a writer-editor. And Tom DeFalco was writing Amazing. He was an editor and a writer." So he said he's surrounded by some of the most solid editors in the business, so the kid can't fail. Of course, the first thing the kid did was fire Louise and Al, and then ultimately fired DeFalco. So now, you can argue about, he fired Al, but he hired Peter David. He gave Peter David his first chance at writing. So who's going to hate him for that, right?
Right.
They did amazing stuff together. So there's all this back and forth, and I've always refused to just see things in black and white. It just doesn't work for me that way. And again, I mean, I do think that he was under a hell of a lot of pressure. He was younger than I was at the time, and he was given the Spider-Man titles to edit. I mean, I think the poor guy was in over his head. I think he was feeling pressure from all kinds of different directions, and I do think that he was seeing things creatively differently than what we were doing. I don't think he might necessarily was agreeing with what we were doing creatively. He thought Spider-Man could be better, and he made the call. I mean, that's the thing. The irony of the situation for me was that Tom DeFalco told me at one point, Jim Shooter came in and said, "What's going on the Spider-Man books? What's this I hear about you being fired?" And Tom went, "You're asking me?"
Yeah.
You hired the guy, go talk to your editor. I mean, so there's that. Virginia Romita came into Tom's office and said, "I just heard you got fired off the Spider-Man books because you can't hit a deadline." And Tom went, "That's what he said." He said, "Tom, you guys are the most ahead in the house. I use you guys as the stick that I hit everybody else with."
Yeah.
That's
because
amazing.
Before he fired us, at one point, using company money, at one point, Jim Owsley got clearance to come into Pittsburgh, fly he and Tom DeFalco into Pittsburgh. We went to one of the more expensive restaurants in the city to have this big editorial meeting. And I'm like, oh boy, what's going on here? And basically, he handed us a new schedule that he wanted us to meet. And we met it. And then he handed us another schedule to meet. And we met that one. And then he fired us. Like I said, there was a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes, I'm sure. So.
Now, how did you get then moved to the Thor title in 1987? Tell us about that transition.
Well, that transition was like a year or more of the only work I had when I was fired off of Spider-Man.
Right.
Because I had quit. I quit Kickers after 3 issues because it just wasn't the book we wanted to do. And, we were banging heads with editorial and everything. So I got off of that. And then we were fired off of Spider-Man. The only work I had for Marvel at the time was a graphic novel that I was supposed to do with Joe Duffy, a Punisher graphic novel. And frankly, it was this she ended up doing it with Jorge Safino. I forget what the title of it was, but it was an amazing story. Involved the Yakuza and all this kind of stuff. It was incredible. But I just felt I couldn't do it justice. I just couldn't. So after doing some thumbnails on it and trying to do some layout work on it and doing some little design work on it, I ended up giving it back to the editor. He was not happy with it. I think it was Larry Hama. It was either Larry Hama or Carl Potts. Mm-hmm. But whoever it was very disappointed in me, and I think I really hurt my rep with that person,
No.
But I gave that back, so I didn't have anything going on. And around that time, Mike Carlin called, and I did that Superman annual with John Byrne, with Titano. And around that time, I got the call from Ralph Macchio to do some Thor fill-ins. We did the Secret Wars fill-in, and we did the Dargo Thor fill-in.
I love those 2 comics so much. That was when I was starting to pick up comics off a newsstand. I love that stuff with a passion.
Oh, thank you. Now, Brett and I worked together on that first Superman annual, and we worked together on those 2 pieces. And at that point, Walt Simonson was moving off of Thor. But remember, for the last few years, a lot of people seem to forget, for the last few years, he had been writing it and Sal had been drawing it.
Yeah, Sal Buscema was drawing the end of it. Yeah.
And Tom was being hired as the new writer with Sal. Okay? And that was the way it was going to be. And apparently Jim Shooter really liked what we did on the Secret Wars Thor fill-in because, and again, this has nothing to do with comparing artists because Mike Zeck had a whole different plate full of things he had to accomplish in any given issue of Secret Wars. Okay? I wouldn't have taken that job on a bet. I mean, he had so much he was trying to do in that book. But apparently, because we had done that Secret Wars fight sequence that was recreating some stuff from that issue of Secret Wars, Shooter noticed it and really liked it. And he said, well, why don't we just put Friends on Thor with Tom? And he goes, that's fine, except Thor already has an artist, Jim. And he goes, well, we'll just tell Sal that you're bringing your own artist along. And he goes, except that's not true.
Yes.
Come on. Ron and I are not joined at the hip. No, we're not going to do that. And Tom told me that there was some talk like that. And I said, Tom, I'm sorry. If you think I'm going to stand here and watch Sal get removed from a title for me, that's not happening. No way. But then what he said is when they were having one of these meetings, Jim Salicrup, God love him, walked in and said, does anybody have a problem if I hire Sal Buscema to do Peter Parker again? Because I want to get these books all up and running solid. And I mean, it would be great if Sal could come back on Spectacular. And everybody looked at each other and went, hallelujah. And Sal was thrilled to go back on Spider-Man, and I went on Thor with DeFalco, and everybody lived happily ever after.
And your Thor run, I felt that what you and DeFalco did was you brought back a lot of the magic from the Jack Kirby Stan Lee run. Was that intentional? Were you kind of looking at a lot of those old 60s issues?
Well, the two things. One was Tom wasn't sure he could do Cosmic. He preferred characters like The Thing and Peter Parker, and he wasn't sure he could do Thor. Ralph Macchio said, you just did 2 issues. And he goes, yeah, but those were fill-ins. I don't know. Well, we'll talk about it. So, because I was all hot to do it. I mean, as soon as they offered it to me, I was, I'm a big Buscema fan, a big Kirby fan, so I was all hot to do it. And I was sure Tom could do it too, but that's one of the reasons why Tom started off by doing the Celestials, because he figured, let's go big, let's go big or go home and see what happens. The biggest thing that pushed us in the direction of the traditional Thor was that we both knew we couldn't do what Walt was doing, because Walt's connection to that material was so personal. His connection to the Norse myth, his connection to that storyline. I mean, he had done it when he was a kid. Remember, he had drawn most of it when he was a kid, and was recreating it as a professional. We could have tried to do Walt, but we would have failed miserably, I'm sure. Because people know when they're being shucked. So we knew we couldn't do that. So we were going to try to do a transitional phase where we just go real big in Cosmic. And and our connection to Thor was the Lee Kirby stuff, and the Lee Buscema stuff. I mean, I grew up reading the Jerry Conway, John Buscema stuff, and so we were going to go Cosmic, but we also talked about it, and we wanted Thor to have the whole Eric Masterson thing, even though it didn't happen until a year or so into the run, was something we had talked about from the very beginning. Is giving him is merging him and giving him a human identity again, a human connection to Earth, because we just felt that was something that helped the character. I mean, even Walt gave him Sigurd Jarlsson, gave him that identity as a connection. I mean, Thor should have that connection, because what makes Thor not just your typical Asgardian is his connection to us, his connection to Earth. And so Tom and I talked about all of that, but that was. There wasn't so much an edict like we should just go do Lee Kirby. A lot of that was me, because the same way I studied Ditko when I was first awarded Spider-Man, I went deep into Kirby when I was first awarded Thor. And there were people that weren't happy about it. Brett Breeding wasn't happy about it. He loved those 2 fill-ins we did. It was more my natural style, kind of Buscema-ish. And Brett was much more a fan of that. As I started to go more Kirby in our early run, he was pushing back against it. He wasn't crazy about it, and I understand where he's coming from. I think some of the best stuff we did together, as far as blending with him, he finally decided to stop fighting the Kirby, and we did in Thor 400 when Cynic came on board. There was a sequence we did called "I This Hammer," or "If You Knew Uru Like I Knew Uru." It was inked by Brett. And it's some of my favorite Thor stuff that we did together, because I was able to get some of the Kirby weight into the characters, but Brett was embracing it instead of fighting it, and I thought it worked great. Plus, Brett colored it himself. And there's like a couple of pinups in there that are just like, wow.
Yeah, I love the whole buildup with the set storyline. Such an explosive issue that was. And you guys co-created a lot. In 388, you went inside a Celestial's brain, right?
Right.
And I remember reading that going, my God, so that's what's in there.
Well, I mean, Tom, like I said, that was Tom challenging himself to see if he could do Cosmic. He's just a big dive into the deep end of the pool kind of guy. And what really worked with the first couple of years on Thor, is how tightly plotted it is. Tom is a structure guy, okay?
Yeah.
Second to none. I mean, of course, I'm a big Tom DeFalco fan, but I don't think there's anybody better working, not just in comics, just as a writer, at structure. He knows how to plot things to get the biggest impact out of it, to get the information out there, and he will sow seeds early on, because first we introduced Lear and the Celtic Gods.
Right.
And then we go into the celestial stuff, which there's things going on the B story where Asgard's under attack and these hit and run, even the Lear story involved a hit and run attack from the Seth people. And so we have that percolating as the B story. And I mean, the guy's incredible at those kinds of things, when to bring something up into the spotlight and when to let it fall back into a B story. And to this day, I just marvel at his ability to structure and plot to the greatest effect.
Concise and it really maximizes the impact. Yeah, and there's a lot of characters. There is Mongoose, Quicksand, Earth Force, Grog, the New Warriors, Stellaris, Nobilis, Eric Masterson, I love that character. Then Code Blue, Dargo, you mentioned, the Thor Corps. How are these brainstorming sessions? Like, did you guys basically, like you said earlier, you guys talk and it would kind of brainstorm out? Were you guys throwing costume ideas at each other? How did all that work?
I'd have to go character by character, incident by incident. There really there's not a real pattern to it. We don't have Thursday, new idea Thursday, pitch me some ideas. No, it was never like that. It was.
But each one has its own kind of mixture of you guys.
Right, exactly. And, some of them came from me. Earth Force is something that I developed in art school. They were called the Aton Trio because the Aton is the sun disk that they have in the palm of their hand. Since we were doing the Egyptian gods and everything, I pitched it to DeFalco, and he goes, well, what's an Aton? And I told him, and he goes, nobody knows what an Aton is. So we came up with the different name, Earth Force, and I think we renamed one of the characters. But, these were the two characters that were based on friends of mine, and the one character was based on me, but I got to do them in a Marvel comic years later. Of course, Eric Larson does that kind of shit all the time. He doesn't care. But for me, that was a big thrill to be able to use something from my past. And, Mongoose was a character we were going to do for Spider-Man, and never got around to him before we were shit-canned. So,
right, because the Mongoose is kind of like a Puma type character in a way.
Well, he was. See, that's the thing. When we create new villains, because that's what's cool about being able to create, is you create somebody. Puma simply was faster than Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
If you read those stories, he has claws, and yes, he's vicious, and yes, he has super senses and all this kind of stuff. But the reason that he was an incredible, deadly foe for Spider-Man is that he's faster than Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Spider-Man's spider sense could go off, and Puma could still nail him.
Yes.
We had never seen that before, And Mongoose was going to be something in a similar vein. The original plan for Mongoose in Spider-Man, because Mongoose shows up in the issue of Spider-Man towards the end of our run, where he fights Crusher Creel and Titania at the airport. They were working for the Masters of Evil, and they go to the airport to pick up Mongoose. But once the fight starts, Mongoose sees what's going on and disappears into the crowd.
Right.
Now, we were going to use him. He was letting the Masters of Evil pay for his ticket, but the reason he was coming to America was that he had a past with the Cobra, and that he was here to kill the Cobra. So I was playing off of an old Hot Wheels racetrack thing called it was the Snake Mongoose Hot Wheels play set.
I had those.
Yeah,
I had both of those. Yeah,
it's Ricky Tikki Tavi.
The Cobra was a green car, and the Mongoose was an orange car. I love those guys.
Yeah. No, that's kind of where it all came from in my brain, that we could do this story where Spider-Man gets caught, because Spider-Man had already fought Cobra with Mr. Hyde a couple times.
That's
and
awesome.
We were going to do something where Spider-Man gets stuck between this grudge match between Mongoose and Cobra. And we never got around to it because we got canned, but we figured we had to rejigger the character a little bit, and we still have never gotten a chance to really tell you his origins. I mean, when we tied him in with High Evolutionary, I think some people are just assuming that he was evolved from a mongoose, which, if maybe, okay, but he does wear he has a foreign dog tag around his neck. And that's always been a part of his design. So why would he be wearing that if he was the evolved mongoose? That kind of thing. So I never had like fully formed ideas, but I always had some idea of who this person was before and why he is the way he is. But so we introduced him in Thor, and we got some real mileage out of him. I mean, he's the one that almost killed Eric Masterson, that made it necessary for Thor to merge with him.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And he was quite a villain, actually, for a lot of issues.
I liked Mongoose. I actually liked our redesign. I redesigned him when he appeared in Thunderstrike. I gave him a new outfit that I really liked his second look a lot. But
I really liked Stellaris. I mean, we know she was, a hot number under that outfit until later, but I liked her character. I liked the tech of her armor and stuff.
Thank you.
So New Warriors, tell us about co-creating the New Warriors. Tell us about that.
Well, that was Tom kind of acting in his capacity as editor-in-chief, because he actually did feel that we should have more teenage characters, because he thought that was the best way to draw teenage readers. He saw that our readership was starting to skew older, and he actually thought that maybe, he contacted some magazine distributors and found out that the most popular magazines at that point were skateboarding magazines, Thrasher magazines. Mm-hmm. And he started to pursue crafting a team of teenage characters. And he just figured, since Thor's the book I'm writing, let's do it in Thor, So he enlisted me in doing some slight redesigns of some of the characters and stuff. But that's, it was always intended for it to spin off into its own title. And of course, they lucked out getting Fabian and Mark Bagley to do it. But, we were just kind of there to light the fuse. And it was those guys.
And it was an awesome fuse. I remember, because that was for Acts of Vengeance, I think.
Right.
And,
right.
And Juggernaut was in that issue. And I remember, I love the artwork of Thor, like, okay, now I'm getting serious. And he really powers up Mjolnir in this, so much tension. I remember when I read that, I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen in the next page? I mean, that I love that.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, the two things with DeFalco that were always fun for me, because he's a total pro, so don't misread me, but he has an element to him that I think most fans would appreciate, in that he can still think like a fan, even though he's a total professional.
Yeah.
And the thing he used to break through the celestial brain dome, where he channeled the Asgardian energy of his own body through the hammer and all this kind of stuff, was something that Lee and Kirby he used it against Galactus one time.
Yeah.
And when I say Tom thinks like a fan, his attitude is, if Thor can do that, why doesn't he do it more?
Yeah, that makes sense. And fans
he used it sparingly. He used it against the Celestial Dome, and he used it against the Juggernaut, because nothing else defeats the Juggernaut. Otherwise, you're just sending the Juggernaut to different dimensions all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we used it against the Juggernaut, and it didn't really do much, unfortunately. But, that was Tom using the past of the character effectively. And, I had no problem with, Thor occasionally pulling out the big gun and trying to do some real damage, that kind of thing. I think that's what's interesting to me is our Thor run is seems to be very much embraced by fans. His Fantastic Four run, not so much, but I actually see them as having a lot of parallels, because somehow Eric Masterson isn't held against him the way getting rid of Reed for a while was, that kind of thing. And so I don't really completely grasp it or understand it, because I felt that they were both very much the same kind of roller coaster ride,
Yeah. Well, I liked both. So tell us, as you mentioned, Eric Masterson, Thor, turns out he was kind of hiding in Eric Masterson's brain there subconsciously, but tell us about evolving Eric Masterson into him becoming Thor and then starting the Thunderstrike title in 93.
Well, initially, like I said, from very early on, we knew we were going to introduce Eric, and we knew what our plan was for Eric, but we wanted to do a slow burn on it. We wanted the readers to get to know Eric and to like Eric just as a supporting character before we ever pulled the trigger on the other stuff. And I think from talking to people, I think we succeeded in making Eric a likable guy and an admirable guy before we struck him down. So we knew why Thor was connected to this man. It wasn't just, not that Thor might not have done the same thing for just a guy on the street, but that certainly wasn't the case. He knew that Eric would have done the same for him, type of thing. So when we merged them, it was just great fun. Tom wanted to do it, and my only hesitation at all was that he wanted a different look. And I said, well, I can't really say yes then until I come up with something I like. And I sat at a table at a friend's house with Brett Breeding, and we threw some ideas on paper, and we came up with a look that I liked. And so I called DeFalco, and I said, okay, we can pull the trigger on this now because now I know what he looks like, and I'm happy enough with it, and we're good. And he said, okay.
I love that costume. I think it's great.
Thank you. I still, to this day, I think it utilized some stuff that Walt came up with, and I think it streamlined it without changing it that much. And
I love that show, The Greatest American Hero. Right. And I love the idea of this kind of kooky, funny blonde dude getting powers he doesn't understand, and he's crashing into buildings like he's not sure how to do it. And he's a funny guy, socially awkward. And I felt like the Eric Masterson Thor, it felt like that to me. So when I read it, I mean, it felt like putting on a glove that I understood. I loved it. And I love that character. And I really enjoyed him and his odd couple thing going on with Hercules. I love those issues. I think that's hilarious.
Well, thank you. We were having fun with it too. And I always think that if the creators are having fun, then I think the readers are having fun as well. But it was, it was a great ride. I mean, I woke up every day we were on Thor knowing that these were going to be the good old days someday, because we were having fun creating, and the book was selling well, and Ralph Macchio was happy with it, and it was just a wonderfully creative time. It was great fun. But yeah, Eric was, we really didn't work all that hard on Eric. We wanted Eric to be a plain, regular, decent guy that you wouldn't mind hanging out with, and then hand him the keys to the kingdom and see how it goes. The only problem with having him be a bit of a screw, the readers don't really like it if your lead character is a screw up for too long, So we always try to put him in a different situation. Like once he started to get comfortable, then we would take him to Asgard and we'd have him deal with some of that stuff. And in much the same way that once we gave Peter Parker the symbiote, you had to make sure, as long as, that was a very science fiction-y thing to do to Spider-Man, but as long as Peter reacted like Peter to all this bizarreness, it's okay, right? So what we did that kind of freshened up the strip, I think, for a lot of people, is we got rid of the Shakespearean dialogue when it came to Eric, and you were seeing everything in the Thor strip through fresh eyes. You were seeing them all through Eric's eyes. And I think that tends to freshen things up, not just for the readers, but for us as well, for the creators as well. I mean, there's one sequence we did early on with Eric where he goes to Asgard, and the Asgardians are all they have to go save Odin, and Baldur's saying, we may lose soldiers in the attack, but we've got to attack Annihilus, and we've got to get Odin back for Odin, for Asgard. And Eric is standing in the back, and he goes, couldn't we sneak in?
Yeah.
And all the Asgardians look at each other and go, we don't really sneak that much. Okay. That kind of thing. And so moments like that, I loved. I just thought they were wonderful,
Yeah. And Tom, when we interviewed him, I asked him about that, and he can insert like that funny book mode in the middle of the drama, which is pretty cool. So then one more question, then Jim's going to go to the next section is, so when Thunderstrike starts up, that's kind of like when Image was really like exploding and there's a collector's market. You guys had these kind of fancy covers and all that. First, what'd you think of the Image revolution when it happened? How did that reflect on the sales of Thunderstrike?
It probably couldn't hurt. I mean, unfortunately, the speculator market was insane at the time. So I'm sure we probably we sold a lot of copies, but I bet you there's a lot of people still have them in the warehouse too, that kind of thing. It was a very bizarre time because we were getting ready to wrap up Eric's storyline, and it was the sales department that came to us and said, we were thinking about we think you should spin Eric off in his own book. And Tom said, really? The idea came from the sales department. We had to come up with something. It was not our idea to have him become a solo character, but we then huddled and came up with Thunderstrike and the name and the mace and all that kind of stuff. So it was all us, but it was at the behest of the sales department. And it was delayed because my mom had a stroke. And my brain was not where it needed to be to get it out. I think it was supposed to come out in April, and it didn't come out till August or something like that. But anyway, when we finally did get it up and running, it had some foil on the cover. I put like one lightning bolt behind him that was supposed to be foil, and production went in and put a lot of lightning bolts in there to make it foil, and it works. I mean, I think it's a solid cover still to this day. And it did sell well, and I made some money. I think I got like $2 a book to sign 5,000 copies or something like that. It was nuts.
Oh, nice.
It was just a crazy, crazy time for collecting, and I don't like that. I don't like the slabbing. I'm an old man. I don't like the slabbing now. I didn't like the collector frenzy then. DeFalco was one of the people that was saying, guys, didn't we just see this happen to baseball cards and collector cards? Are we going to just stand here and let it happen to comics too? And sure as hell that they did. I mean, the whole market exploded. But and the book sold solid. I mean, the book was only canceled after 2 years, along with Forceworks and a bunch of other books, because the Perlman's people, Ron Perlman's people, came in and bought the company there and decided that canceling half the line would make the half that's left sell twice as well. And Tom was at the meeting where they pitched that, and he laughed out loud and realized they weren't kidding, and that's how he got marked for termination. So it was just a very bad time for comics in general and Marvel in particular. As far as how it worked with the Image guy, I never begrudged the Image guys going off on their own. I wish they wouldn't have talked about it as much, because if you remember, there was a lot of talk before the books finally came out. They were talking. They were yapping about it for like a year and a half or 2 years before the books finally showed up.
Right.
And that I didn't agree with, but I mean, I don't begrudge these guys their own success. I mean, Mark Silvestri is one of the nicest guys I've ever met in the industry, and any success he has, God love him. I mean, I got no problem with any of these guys. I mean,
right.
Were you frustrated by Heroes Reborn when they did come back? And
the reason I was frustrated with I wasn't so frustrated with Heroes Reborn. I was frustrated with. Well, wait a minute. Yeah, that was Heroes Reborn. Yes, I was frustrated with them, and I'll tell you why. The reason I was frustrated is when Thunderstrike was canceled, it was canceled because nobody would have considered canceling Thor. But then just a year or two later, they do Heroes Reborn, and they hand stuff over to the Image guys, and what happened? They canceled Thor.
Yeah.
That's
right.
Pissed me off. I mean, that really bugged me, yes. But when they brought Thor back, they brought him back with John Romita Jr. and Klaus Janson and stuff. So, I mean, he certainly got his due when they brought him back. But, yeah, that part of it was very, very frustrating. Sure.
So when you were there, when the Image guys were at peak power, was there pressure? I know that some people had to change their art a lot to stay current or relevant. Was there pressure for you to draw differently? I think about how Herb Trimpe changed completely in what he was doing.
Well, that was Herb's choice. My understanding is, that there were some guys who embraced that more than others. The one thing I noticed was that Al Milgrom started handling some of the detail a little differently. I think he thought he was kind of leaning into that a little bit, He would break up the blacks a little bit more, and we would talk occasionally, and I'm going, Al, as far as I'm concerned, you don't need to do that. And he said, no, it's not really for you, Ron, that kind of thing. So, and so I understood where he was coming from, but I never worried about it. maybe in some of the storytelling I would acknowledge it. I would try to open up. The one guy that I really admired when we were going into Thunderstrike was John Romita Jr. And JR had done a cable miniseries at that point, and he was doing, I think, The Punisher, Warzone, and things like that. And so there was elements of his type of storytelling and his type of using splash pages and everything that I incorporated into Thunderstrike #1 and to some of the later issues of Thunderstrike. But beyond that, I really could only do it if I understood what they were doing. And quite frankly, putting lines all over somebody's face that don't mean anything, I never understood it. I mean, I can pick a light source and I can shadow it more or something, but those lines don't mean anything. So yeah. I couldn't do it. I mean, it maybe if you would have brought in a different inker that understood what that stuff was, they could have inked over me and added it. I don't know, but I couldn't put it in my pencils because I didn't. What the hell is that supposed to be? I mean, I understand what cross-hatching is, but my God, who has lines all over their face?
So what were your last days at Marvel at this point like? You had lost Thunderstrike. Did you have any assignments, or were you just...
No.
Because you were kind of under contract, weren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, I was under contract for several years on Thor and for Thunderstrike. And Mark Grunwald was in charge of that unhappy job. He tried desperately to find me some work so I could keep my contract, and he had to call me at one point and say, Ron, I'm just sorry, it's just not there. And I said, Mark, thank you for all of your efforts. I know you've been busting your ass, and I know it's been heartbreaking in that company lately. I said, and I can't thank you enough. I'm okay. I got a call from Mike Carlin. Brett Breeding had told him that Thunderstrike was ending. And Mike Carlin will not. He does not believe in poaching talent at all. If you're busy on something for another company, he will not approach you. But when Brett told him that Thunderstrike was over, he called and offered me the slot on Superman. So I was able to tell Mark Grunwald, I'll be okay. I said, I know you got plenty of other people to worry about. You go worry about them. I'll be okay. And I went over to Superman for a couple of years.
Can you talk a little bit more about Mark Grunwald? You know, when we interview a lot of people, they talk about Archie Goodwin as being the best editor they ever worked with.
God, he was incredible. Archie was incredible, yeah. And so was Mark. They were both cut from the same cloth. They were both incredibly professional people who never lost sight of the child inside them. That's the two things that they had in common. They were an incredibly important type of person to have in a company like Marvel. People that understood their adult responsibilities and did their jobs well to the top of the standard, but also were very childlike and joyful. And I didn't know Mark Grunwald well. I wish I had known him better. He was very close with Tom DeFalco. So when I was in the offices, a few times I was in the offices, he was very welcoming and very warm. We did shows around that time where Mark would do Marvel Olympics and Marvel game shows and stuff to involve the audience and to make use of the people from Marvel that were there. You know, it's back when Marvel had an expense account and all that kind of stuff, you know. And so we would do like a Marvel version of Hollywood Squares. We would do Marvel Olympics where we would do stupid things and crawl under chairs. And it was just for goofy fun. And
it sounds like bullpen, you know, like that notion that we had in the 60s that there was this magical bullpen where everybody hung out with Stan Lee.
And Mark was the cruise director for all of that. Yeah, you know, I mean, he was just, it was terrific. I remember a couple of times being invited into his office and just sitting and yapping when I would be visiting. And, you know, he was a terrific guy. And I really felt for him those last days at Marvel. I mean, you know, his wife has posted stuff about, in his own journal, he would say, you know, there was just entry after entry where I had to fire so-and-so today. And it just broke his heart. I mean, I couldn't have helped. I mean, it probably contributed greatly to his leaving us. I hate it. I hate the idea that was part of it. And Archie was the same energy. I mean, unfortunately, I didn't know Archie well either. My first trip on a plane as a young man was the premiere of Return of the Jedi in Denver, Colorado. The Marvel people were invited. I was on the regular book, but Archie wrote, and I penciled 10 pages of the actual return adaptation. So rented a tux, flew out to Denver. Joe Duffy was there with a beautiful gown, and Archie had a tux, and we all went to the premiere. We were being hosted by a guy in jeans and sandals, but it was all so silly. But it was the premiere. The mayor of Denver, Colorado was there, and all this kind of jazz, and it was wonderful. And I got to hang around with Archie during that period of time. I remember one time visiting in the offices, and I was in Mary Jo. She only likes to be called Joe. I'm sorry, Joe. Joe Duffy had me back in the office she shared with Archie, and we were sitting there just shooting the breeze. And Archie comes walking in, and she just, indicative of what they kind of thing they would do all the time, she would go, "The floor is lava." And he just started jumping up on desks and crawling across flat files and jumping from chair to desk to get to his seat without touching the floor. And we're just a bunch of kids. It was just wonderful. That was also the office that I met Steve Ditko in briefly, because he was doing a backup. It was called The Gin or something, for a backup for...
Oh, yeah.
What was that book? Not Coyote.
Yeah.
What was it called?
Yeah, it was.
Not it was. It's Coyote.
Coyote?
Yeah.
And he was doing the backups for that. So he came in, and Archie Goodwin went, "Oh, Steve, this is young Ron Frenz. He's the guy that's doing Spider-Man right now. They're making him do you." And Steve turned to me, real, straight face. He's like, "Shame on them." And he put his hand out, and I shook his hand, and I said, "It's an incredible pleasure to meet you, sir. I mean, they're not making me, believe me," that kind of thing. So
he did some good work on that. He had some good inkers, and I like that a lot. We're going to do Superman pretty quickly. So Carlin got you to come over to DC, and it was a very different experience for you from your years at Marvel, wasn't it?
Very, very different. It was very scary and very overwhelming. I don't think I ever really got my feet under me, to tell you the truth. Because they were doing the weekly books, basically, with the triangle numbering, and it was crazy. Mike wasn't the editor anymore. He had been promoted to executive editor. So I had two different editors in the course of that, Joey Cavalieri and, oh my gosh, I'm not thinking of the other gentleman's name. Casey Carlson were my two editors on Superman. They were struggling to keep the team together. I mean, it was a very weird time to be in the Superman books, because parts of the team were starting to break up. Some people were resentful of other people getting certain treatment, and it was just a very, very, very weird time to be on the books. My one Superman summit.
Superman artists at that. I mean, Ordway was still doing stuff.
Ordway had pretty much phased off. Jurgens was writing my title. Bogdanov and Louise were still.
Oh, they were great.
They were still doing Man of Steel. The Roger Stern and Paul Ryan were doing the new quarterly. What was that called? Man of Tomorrow. Who was doing action? Was Butch Geist still there? No, Barry Kitson or was it Kieran Dwyer? I don't know. There were a bunch of different people, but I'm trying to remember who was all at my meeting. I know Raj was there. I know Louise was there. John Bogdanov was there. Dan Jurgens was there. Joey Cavalieri was editor by that point. And it was just, it didn't go well. Every time somebody kind of got a rhythm going with, well, this would be cool to do, somebody had a reason why it wasn't a good idea, that kind of thing. And
too many people in the kitchen, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of people in the kitchen, but when, not to take anything away from Joey Cavalieri or Casey Carlson, but Mike Carlin is a very distinct individual. I mean, Mike Carlin gave up a lot of brain cells and a lot of heart tissue to making those books what they were. And he wrote Herd on an incredibly creative group of people and did it effectively. That is not something everybody can do, especially when the people that are doing it are challenging you because you're not Mike Carlin. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
So I felt very deeply, I felt a lot of compassion for Casey and for Joey, especially Joey.
Tell me about Superman Red, Superman Blue.
You would have to talk to Glenn Whitmore about that. I came up with Superman when they were going to do the changing the powers, and they were going to do the containment suit. They sent out a memo to everybody on the books that said, if you'd like to pitch a new look for Superman, we'll be looking at them. So feel free, if you have an idea, to pitch it, and we will let you know. And I wasn't planning on it. I was kind of the new guy on the books, so I really wasn't planning on doing anything. I couldn't help but think about it when I was done with my work for the day and all that kind of stuff. And I finally was able to put together a look that I kind of liked, and I sent it to them and didn't hear anything more. And they, at one point, sent me my next cover, and they just sent a Xerox of my sketch. And I went, so are we doing a month where we're all going to like preview our designs or something? And they went, no, we picked yours. And I went, oh, nobody told me. They went, well, we're telling you now. We picked your design. And I went, oh, okay. And they gave me like a one-time payment that was really great. And I have all the action figures. They didn't send them me. I had to buy them, but they did a shit ton of action figures off of that design, and
wow.
And I bought the watches with the new S symbol on it and all that kind of stuff, you know. So that was a lot of fun. But I think they picked mine for two reasons. One is from what I saw, I think I might have been the only one that played with the S. I think everybody else kept the S normal. And two, I think they were already looking at doing Superman Red, Superman Blue. It was something that Glenn Whitmore, being the colorist, had wanted to do for a long time. He finally remembered that imaginary story and really wanted to do it. And the fact that my design was monochromatic, I think that helped them choose mine, because they looked at it and they went, oh, look, and he's all blue. We could finally get Glenn Whitmore off our back, and we could do Superman Red, Superman Blue, because they ended up doing that pretty quickly into that whole storyline. So
yeah,
I can't help.
How was Dan Jurgens as a writer?
Dan and I never really had a lot of contact. I got the impression he wasn't happy to have me. He tended to be very critical. We had one or two conversations. We had one or two phone conversations, but he was not welcoming as far as like, he wasn't interested in co-plotting or anything like that. He very much, I think, because one of the things that worked for those books was a little bit of competition between the different titles. And, you know, I think Dan felt that he was in a healthy competition with the other writers. So he wanted to be very clear on what were his ideas. So he really wasn't he wasn't inviting me to like pitch a bunch of ideas and stuff. That never came up. I mean, but I didn't feel like I needed to, because the books were up and running. He had been writing them for years at that point, you know. It wasn't a collaboration at all like it was with Joe Duffy or Tom DeFalco or Roger Stern or any of those guys, but it worked. But like I said, I was overwhelmed. I mean, you had to like hit the ground running every month and turn in layouts almost immediately and turn in pencils as quickly as possible. And just, I don't mean this in any other way other than speaking for myself. It was a meat grinder. I had a hard time. There were individual issues that I was happy with the way they came out, and I was certainly proud to be working on Superman and thankful to be working on Superman. But it was a meat grinder. I don't think I really rose to the occasion very well. The guys that did it for a long time, the Brett Breedings and the John Bogdanovs and the Roger Sterns and the Dan Jurgenses and the Jerry Ordways, the guys who actually did it for any period of time, they have nothing but my respect, because it was a tough gig. It was a very tough
And last
gig.
Superman question, you tried to bring DeFalco over to DC at that point too, didn't you?
Now, that was after I was on Strange Visitor. That was after they decided to throw me that bone, since I had designed the suit and they wanted to do it as a separate character. That was a whole separate process that I tried to bring Tom over for, but it didn't work out.
And that didn't turn into the book that it was supposed to be launched.
It was supposed to be an ongoing, and when it didn't turn into an ongoing, I said, so do I go back on Superman? And they went, no, because we just hired a whole bunch of new teams. And I went, oops. So, again, being born under a lucky star, I had somewhere else to land.
That takes us back to Alex.
We had done Spider-Girl, so we ended up going back. I ended up going back to do MC2 with Tom, yeah.
I love that. I've read all of them. I like the ones that you penciled the most. I will say that, but I do love.
Now,
I do
don't
love
be
the whole
stuck
story.
up, Alex. Don't be
No, I
stuck
do
up.
because I
Pat
grew
Olive
up on your
deserves-
stuff, so
Pat Olive deserves your love and respect.
no, I do, and I do because he did some Spider-Man stuff too. I do enjoy his stuff a lot, but because I was so used to your Thor, I think I just gravitated more to that. But that being said, I loved all the issues of Spider-Girl. That What If 105, yeah, it spawned the MC2 series. This was before the later Thunderstrike Vol-2 you guys did, but you worked on a grown-up Kevin Masterson in A Next. So how was that? How was kind of continuing everyone growing up, basically?
It was great. I mean, what I said about Thor, knowing that those were the good old days, I would say that A-Next is probably the most wildly, enjoyably creative period that I've ever had professionally in comics.
Yeah.
Because Tom was editing all the books that first year, and so there may have been a slight shift in the percentages with my contributing to plotting and stuff on A-Next, and we just had a fantastic time. We were doing the kind of comics that we enjoyed and seeing if we could catch a market with it, and that first year was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was cool to see Nova kind of grow up, and he was had a different personality at that point.
Well,
he was taking himself way more seriously.
Yeah, well, that was actually, I was, even when Pat was drawing the book, I was occasionally whispering into Tom's ear or into Pat's ear and all that kind of stuff. And I designed the adult Nova, and my idea was we needed to pick one guy who was from the prior generation. And basically what I saw was Nova was that generation's Superman.
Yeah.
He was the establishment now. I mean, to our younger characters, he was the big guy. He had the ship that orbited this. He was a cross between Superman and Space Ghost. He had the starship orbiting in geosynchronous orbit, and he was the guy.
Yeah.
And that whenever I got a chance to draw him, he always had the jutting jaw and was always literally looking down on Spider-Girl, that kind of thing. Yeah, that was how I kind of saw him. As I kind of picked him as the guy who was a teen in the prior generation who was now the Superman.
And then you ended up back on Spider-Girl. The series was doing pretty well at that point. Tell us about what were the circumstances that got you back onto Spider-Girl after Pat Olive? Well,
I was kind of the regular fill-in guy. What little Pat needed that. I mean, Pat's a machine. He really didn't have need for anybody to be a net or anything. But I would do the occasional fill-ins. I was doing catch-can freelance around the business, not really even the comics business as much. I was finding work elsewhere. I did some storyboarding and things like that for companies in California. But what ended up being the case was that Pat had gotten on the radar of some important people at the time at Marvel. Bill Jemas was the publisher or something like that, but he was still involved creatively. He wanted to write. He kind of wanted to be Stan Lee. And he had seen Pat's work and really liked it. So Pat was offered this work. Spider-Girl was going to be canceled with issue 60, I believe. And Pat had been offered this work involving Bill Jemas that was going to put him on the radar of some important people and hopefully lead to more work and everything. But it was going to require that he leave Spider-Girl early. And he really didn't want to do that. But he couldn't really turn down the new work either, knowing Spider-Girl was canceled. So they actually called me to say, would you be willing to come on board and do the last few issues of Spider-Girl? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of coming back on board just to kind of steer her into the dock there. And so I came in for the end of Season of the Serpent, and 60 was, I think it was 60, was supposed to be the last issue. The one with all the female characters on the cover, it was inked by Al Williamson and everything, and it ends with a splash page. That was supposed to be the final issue of Spider-Girl. And as we were, no, there was going to be one more, because we started, the last issue of Spider-Girl was going to be a flash forward another 15 years. And Benji was going to be a teenager, and Mayday was going to be Tom plotted the whole thing. Mayday was going to be pushing 30 and all kinds. It was a cool little story. I penciled the first 3 or 4 pages. Al Williamson inked the first 2 or 3 pages, And then we got word that we weren't canceled again on April Fool's Day.
Right.
They called Tom and said the book's not canceled, and he finally figured out that it really wasn't canceled, and they needed a plot by the next Tuesday or something. And my reaction when I got a call from the office was, so you're bringing Pat back, right? And they said, well, Pat's working on these other projects with Bill Jemas. And I said, I know, but if he knows that Spider-Girl's not canceled, he's going to want to come back to Spider-Girl.
Right.
And I talked to Pat about it, and he says, Ron, I'm okay here. Spider-Girl, you co-created her. Go do Spider-Girl. And I said, okay. So I was back on Spider-Girl.
Yeah. And you worked on Spider-Girl till 2010. I mean, it went for a while, like 12 years or something, that series.
Oh, yeah, we went to 100. We went from 61 to all the way to 100. And then that was only canceled with the idea we had to lie about it, but they were already planning on doing the relaunch as Amazing Spider-Girl.
Yes.
And then we did Amazing Spider-Girl for 30 issues.
Uh-huh.
Then we did Spectacular Spider-Girl turned into like a 4 or 5 issue miniseries. And then we went into the Spider-Man family for another couple of years worth of stories, I guess. Yeah, it went on for quite a while after I came back. I mean, that's the thing. When it survived the cancellation at 60-61, that was still based on what Tom and Pat were doing. So
yes.
I didn't really feel like I was a part of that other than I was benefiting from it. But when we got to the next time that it was going to be canceled and it survived, then I knew, okay, people have been seeing my work, so they're still supporting the book. That's good. And I slowly became more acclimated. I mean, I was really working in Pat's shadow those first couple of years back. I was just trying to do a cartoonier version of what he was doing, and I mean, the character got really skinny and very cartoony. And I look back on this stuff now, and I'm not all that crazy about it. But I finally got to a point where I was able to put the ghost of Pat Olive behind me and kind of re-embrace my own attitudes about the characters and stuff. I mean, early on when I was pitching stories, I was always pitching stories that were MC2 stories but weren't Spider-Girl stories because I wanted to bring all my old friends back. I wanted to do all the characters at once. And Tom would constantly say, Ron, that's an interesting story, but it's not a Mayday story. We need to do stories about Mayday. And he was absolutely right. So,
yeah, I love the whole MC2 thing because I was growing up with the characters. So it felt like a continuity for me. So then you did some Captain America story, Sentinels of Liberty, a couple issues. Then tell us about doing Thunderstrike Vol-2 because I really like Eric Masterson. It was cool to see kind of the Earth 616 version of Kevin kind of grow into him being a teenager. So were you guys kind of thinking, okay, we have to make this different from what we did with him in A Next?
Oh, absolutely.
Tell us about the genesis of that.
Well, what happened was DeFalco, we were wrapping up Spider-Girl, and DeFalco sent out an email to everybody at Marvel that said, Ron and I are wrapping up Spider-Girl. Does anybody have anything they'd be interested in having us do? And I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. It was somebody who was in charge of, like, the trade paperbacks or something like that. I forget. He was an editor in charge of something. And he went, well, I don't know about everybody else, but I'd love to see you do a Thunderstrike miniseries. Mm-hmm. Without telling us what he wanted it to be, he just said, how about a Thunderstrike miniseries? And Tom, and we kind of went, oh, well, there's some interest anyway. And then the next time Tom was in the office, he found out it was already on the schedule.
Yeah.
And he went, Ron, this is scheduled. I went, what? We don't even have an idea. And he went, I know, we better get one fast because this thing is scheduled. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we thought, are we going to bring Eric back? And Tom and I had both gone through major losses at that point. So we did not feel it would be playing fair with the readers to just bring him back because we didn't feel like we had an idea that sold it at all, So it became second generation. It became doing Kevin again. And we basically just had a handshake agreement that wherever we went right with the MC2 Kevin, we'd go left with the 616 Kevin. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did. So, that's kind of how we ended up where we ended up. It kind of fell through the cracks. I mean, to this day, I talk to Thunderstrike fans at conventions who don't know that Kevin had his own miniseries in the 616, that kind of thing. So It's like a lot of things these days. A lot of my fans have moved on and are now collecting Randy Bowen statues and original art, and they don't really keep track of what's being done in the comics, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I do like that Kevin was used again, even after you guys were finished with the volume 2. That I think in Guardians of the Galaxy or one of those that he was in there for
as Guardians of the Galaxy. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I like that they're using him.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with them, keeping him alive. We certainly were hoping that he'd get some use from other writers and other artists and stuff. We certainly didn't do the miniseries just to kill him off. Of course, we were hoping we'd get a series out of it, but it just didn't work out that way. So, it's anytime you create something new, you feel a certain amount of ownership to it. But if you're a grown-up, you realize that Marvel owns it, you don't. And some of it's going to make you wince, and some of it's going to make you weep, and sometimes it's better not to read it at all, that kind of thing.
So, Ron, we're running short on time. I want to ask you a couple of things. After that, you go back to DC, and it's now in New 52 world. Were people happy about that or ashamed of themselves? Or what was it like to be part of New 52?
I didn't feel like a part of anything. What I was called upon to do by different editors, they had started a policy, and I think Bobby Chase, who used to be at Marvel, had something to do with it, where some of the younger artists, the younger illustrators, were having trouble with the blank page. And there was trouble. They had tried to reinstitute plots, but like Tom DeFalco was doing plots for Legion Lost, but the artist Pete Woods, who's a fantastic illustrator, had never worked plot script. We were that far away from Marvel style that he wasn't comfortable working from a plot. He wanted a full script. So they were trying to retrain some of their illustrators to work plot script. So I was doing layouts on Legion Lost for Pete, even though he really didn't need them artistically. He was just for storytelling purposes. And I ended up doing some other books at DC, part of the New 52 stuff, Katana, Justice League Dark. There were a couple other books. What was the 7?
Team
Sovereign 7 or something? It was one of the books that came over from...
Team 7?
Team 7, I guess that's what it was, yeah. Where they included like Black Canary and characters like that. But it was over from Wildstorm. I did layouts on the first few issues of that. And most of it was for no credit because they didn't want to screw up the... what's the word I'm trying to think of? The incentive. They didn't want to divide the incentive further. So they would pay you a flat fee to do these things. I did some Superboys for, I think those were DeFalco stories too. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think he was working on that. So I did
Superboy that was from the tube or what? I mean, it was so strange by that point.
Yeah, it was the New 52 Superboy. And so there was a lot of that going on. And a lot of it, there were a couple of times that I actually got a credit, and it was interesting because, I got a credit on one of the Superboys. It's like a special thanks to Ron Frenz or something. And people assumed that it was because it was a Tom DeFalco story that I must have helped him plot it or something. Believe me, Tom DeFalco does not need my help coming up with story ideas, okay? That credit was because I did thumbnails for the artist. And that was the only reason for it. They did a big crossover at that point between Teen Titans and one of the other groups. I forget what it was, because there was a lot of stuff that was coming over from Wildstorm at that point. But they did a big crossover that it was going to be a big fight scene and all this kind of stuff, and the artist needed some help off of you either working off plots or full scripts. A couple of times I did work off of full scripts. So they were just basically trying to give the new illustrators a leg up so they wouldn't have to deal with the blank page, that kind of thing. So I was doing that. I found out that like Scott McDaniel was doing that, and I think even Larry Hama did some stuff for them, just trying to help out the next generation of illustrators, and get paid for it, that kind of thing. So.
A lot of them still need help today.
Well, that's all a matter of opinion. It's certainly a different world now. I mean, schedules are much more fluid, and deadlines aren't as deadly. These days, with everything just being sold through comic shops, if you miss a deadline, they just resolicit it, and nobody cares. So
and there's
that wasn't the way it used to be.
I mean, people like Chris Samney, there's some fantastic storytellers still today.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, there's more fantastic illustrators out there than ever before. They're just not doing what we remember as being comics. The Marvel style of dynamic storytelling just isn't out there anymore. I don't think there's anybody currently that's really representing that much. But the people that have discovered comics in the last 5-10 years, they don't care. They love the comics that they love. Everybody loves the comics that were being done when they discovered comics. I mean, that's why my wheelhouse is the late 60s and 70s. You know, that's everybody, their ideal comic experience is whatever was going on when they discovered comics. That's what I've found out. And that's completely fair. You know, I mean, that's what makes the world go round. Different opinions.
That's exactly right. Alex, should we leave it? That seems like a good ending.
So, and I would say that when I was a kid, there were two comics I noticed on the newsstand at 7-Eleven, and that was a Thor issue you did with an eyeless on the cover, and they're kind of in a cave. And then there is this Power Man and Iron Fist fighting Chemistro. And those are the two comics that I picked up. The Chemistro one was fine, but the Thor that you and DeFalco did, that sucked me in, where I was like, Mom, I need you to find me a comic shop. I'm going to read these, and I'm going to find out what happened before this, and got me into collecting the Marvel Universe, trade paperbacks, and classic X-Men. Your art, the stories that you and DeFalco told, were my gateway into the entire Marvel Universe, and I love the stuff that you've done. I'm really thrilled with today's podcast, and I can still even now go back and read that stuff, and I feel that same magic as I felt when I was like 12 and look at this stuff.
Well, I appreciate that, Alex. I really do. Of course, we have to give full credit to Jack Kirby, because that Thor cover was ripped off of the Jack Kirby Fantastic Four cover with the Hulk.
And I found that out later.
It all comes back to Kirby.
It does. It does. I know that.
No, and I will say, since we didn't have time to do it now, this has been my history, and currently I'm working for sitcomics.net out in California, doing a book called Blue Baron and working on a book called The Heroes Union, and it is being produced by a gentleman named Darren Henry, who discovered comics in the 70s. So this is very, he sought out Sal Buscema to pencil these books for him, and Sal had retired from penciling, but recommended me because of our work together on Spider-Girl, and Sal is inking this stuff. And again, Darren grew up reading the stuff in the 70s, and that's what he's trying to channel with these books. And they're great fun. I highly recommend them. Sit Comics, there's several titles being done by different artists, all terrific, all with a different voice, and Darren's doing some wonderful work. So I do want to put a pin in that for everybody, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, because it's like sitcoms, but as a comic, right? And that's
right,
kind
because,
of the concept.
Well, that's Darren for years started out working as an assistant on Seinfeld, and has worked on sitcoms most of his life as a writer and a showrunner for Disney and for overseas producers and stuff. That's why he went with Sit Comics. It's not because they're all humor comics or anything. He's writing some really solid superhero stuff, kind of turning some of the tropes on their head and everything, and having a lot of fun with it. So, yeah, definitely check it out. You guys need to check it out, but everybody needs to check it out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right? And also, everyone check out Ron Frenz's Outdoor Life from 2013. He did an interesting segment there that actually does feel like a Marvel comic, but there are no costumes.
That's what they wanted at the time. They wanted it to look more like a Marvel comic. Then the new editor came on and said, that's stupid. We don't want to do that anymore, and I wasn't doing it anymore. But you pays your money and you takes your chances. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, Ron, thanks so much for joining Jim and I today. We had a blast.
Well, it's been a lot of fun for me. Walking down memory lane and everything, I appreciate the fact that you guys are out there doing these podcasts and keeping some of the history alive and informed. So thank you very much, guys.